Section 1. Pre-war signatures, the developers who wrote themselves into the wasteland. There is something almost poetic about a game set in a world where civilization collapsed, where everything human beings built and loved and left behind was swallowed by silence and ash, being secretly full of signatures. Not in any obvious place. Not stamped on a loading screen or credited in a cutscene or announced by a quest marker blinking on the HUD, but buried in the geometry of a ruin. Hidden inside the static of a radio broadcast. Pressed between the lines of a terminal entry that nobody was ever supposed to read. Tucked into the name of a guard whose dialogue you will probably exhaust in 30 seconds before moving on to the next objective. The Fallout series has always rewarded the kind of player who stops walking. The kind of person who, instead of sprinting past a crumbling building on the way to the next waypoint, pauses at the door, pushes it open, and reads every piece of paper inside. Who crouches in front of every skeleton and tries to work out from the evidence, the empty whiskey bottles, the overturned chair, the handwritten note tucked into a breast pocket, what this person's final hours looked like. Who listens to every terminal entry to the end, even when they have found the password they needed 3 entries ago. And when you do that, when you really slow down and pay attention in a way that feels almost archaeological, you start to notice that the wasteland is not just populated by characters from the lore. It is populated by the people who made the game, their jokes, their references, their personal obsessions, their arguments with each other, their affection for movies and music and books that mattered to them during the long hours they spent building a digital apocalypse, their handwriting on the wall, in the most literal possible sense. Let us start at the very beginning, because the original Fallout, released in 1997 by Interplay Entertainment and developed by the studio that would become known as Black Isle Studios, was not some massive corporation's product. It was made by a relatively small team of people who were, by their own later accounts, having a genuinely good time making something they believed in. The game's production was pressured, it always is, but the creative culture at Black Isle during those years encouraged developers to find joy in the work. One of the clearest expressions of that culture was the tradition of hiding personal references inside the game. Easter eggs, inside jokes, tributes to friends, nods to cultural artifacts that had shaped the people doing the shaping. The head of security at the Cathedral, one of the most sinister locations in the entire original Fallout, the seat of the Master's operations, a building where something deeply and irrevocably wrong is happening to human beings in the basement, is a character named Sid Vicious. Not a ghoul with a punk-inspired aesthetic. Not a character whose name you might miss if you are focused on the quest objective. The character is named Sid Vicious, after John Simon Ritchie Beverly, the bass player for the Sex Pistols, the 21-year-old who died in a New York City hotel room in February of 1979, in circumstances that have never been entirely resolved. The Cathedral is a place of horror, a place where the game asks you to reckon with what happens when ideology and science and power combine without any check on cruelty. And sitting in its security office, dressed in whatever the game engine gave him to wear, is someone named after one of the most famous punk icons in music history. Nobody explains it. Nobody draws your attention to it. There is no note on the wall saying, "Look, we made a reference." It is simply there for the player who bothers to read the names of the people in the rooms they walk through. There is also, in the game files, a character whose name was listed as Richard Gray. Not a particularly memorable name on its own. Not one that would trigger recognition in most players. But the person who worked on level design for some of the most beloved games in the years surrounding Fallout's release was a designer known publicly by the handle Levellord, whose actual name is Richard Gray. He contributed his skills to games including Blood, Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, and Sin, a roster of first-person shooters that defined a specific era of PC gaming. Someone on the Fallout team thought it was worth spending time they did not have to spare on burying his name in a character in the game's files. Whether that was a tribute, an inside joke between colleagues who knew each other's work, or just a developer with a few spare minutes and a mischievous impulse, is something nobody has ever fully explained. The character was cut before the final game shipped. The name stayed in the files. And then there is a dog. Not dog meat, not a companion, not a creature with game mechanical significance. A dog named Sasha belonging to a character called Vince DiNardo. The Fallout Bible, the internal lore document that Black Isle used to maintain consistency across the franchise's early history, lists Vince DiNardo as one of Interplay's actual employees. Sasha was his real dog. Somewhere in the long, pressured development cycle of a post-nuclear role-playing game about the collapse of American civilization, a developer sat at their keyboard and decided that their colleague's dog deserved to be immortalized in code, that the pet would exist forever, or at least as long as the game file survived, as a small piece of the world they were building. If you want to understand why Fallout feels different from other games, why it has a warmth and a humanity even in its darkest moments, this is a good place to start looking. Fallout 2, released in 1998 and developed under enormous time pressure, the team had roughly 9 months to build the entire game. A schedule that by any reasonable measure was impossible doubled down on this tradition and expanded it. The conditions of development were difficult enough that the creative freedoms that made the original game distinctive were at constant risk of being compressed away by deadline pressure. But the developers resisted. Black Isle's approach to Easter egg insertion in Fallout 2 was systematic in a way that the first game's was not. The designers were encouraged, explicitly, to add personal references and pop culture nods wherever they could find room for them, as a way of maintaining creative engagement and making the work feel personal, even when the schedule made everything feel like survival. The result is a game that almost hums with inside jokes, some of them obvious, most of them not. One of the more well-known examples involves the Pip-Boy screen in the world map view. In the bottom right corner, where a corporate logo sits, there are 2 strings of text that are small enough and positioned well enough that the overwhelming majority of players have never noticed them. L5, AA23, and TK421. The second one is a direct lift from Star Wars TK. 421 is the designation of the stormtrooper whose armor Luke Skywalker and Han Solo steal on the Death Star, a number that George Lucas placed in the film almost as an afterthought, and that Star Wars fans have memorized the way they memorize all the other numbers in that franchise. L5, AA23 references the Lagrange point. L5, a gravitationally stable position in space that science fiction writers and actual space engineers have long discussed as an ideal location for permanent orbital colonies. Someone on the Fallout 2 team went out of their way to plant a Star Wars reference and a space colonization reference in a corner of the UI that existed in every session of every playthrough and that almost nobody ever looked at, carefully enough to read. There is another Easter egg in Fallout 2 that requires specific knowledge of the game's main menu to access. Holding the Shift key and clicking the Credits button produces a different result than clicking Credits normally. Instead of the standard credits screen, you get something that the team clearly built for themselves, a collection of quotes and in-jokes from the development team that reads as the kind of humor that emerges from a group of people who have spent too many consecutive hours in the same building working on the same problem. It is an archaeological artifact of the game's development culture, visible only to the player who happens to press Shift while clicking. The fact that this exists at all, that someone coded it, that it survived the final build process, that it shipped in a game that was already running behind schedule tells you something about the priorities of the people who made Fallout 2. They found time for the things that mattered to them. When Bethesda took over the Fallout franchise with Fallout 3 in 2008, they brought their own tradition of developer self-reference with them, shaped by years of building the Elder Scrolls games with similar sensibilities. The location known as Bethesda Ruins, a bombed-out stretch of what was once a real suburb of Washington, D.C., is an obvious nod to the developer's own name and geographic location. Bethesda, Maryland is where Bethesda Game Studios has been based for many years. Placing a destroyed, irradiated version of your own hometown inside a post-apocalyptic video game is not exactly subtle, but it is genuinely affectionate. The message it sends is something like, "We are here, building this game about the end of the world, and we thought it would be funny to put our town in it. Look, here is where we work, and it has been completely destroyed by nuclear war. We think this is funny." The Bethesda Underworks, the subway section running beneath those ruins, is infested with feral ghouls and raiders, which has led players to make various interpretations about what this says about the suburb of Bethesda, Maryland. The development team at Bethesda Game Studios has not issued a formal comment about whether they consider this a joke at their own expense. What is less frequently noted is how much of the texture of Fallout 3's Washington, D.C. environment reflects the team's genuine familiarity with the actual city. The geographic compression is necessary. The real Washington is much larger than any open-world game can faithfully represent at playable scale, but the landmarks are positioned with care that goes beyond mere acknowledgement of their existence. The Washington Monument stands in its correct spatial relationship to the Lincoln Memorial. The National Mall runs between them in the right direction. The Potomac River sits where rivers sit in the real city. The people who built Fallout 3's capital Wasteland clearly knew the actual city. They walked those streets, they looked at those buildings, they brought that knowledge to the work of destroying everything. Lead designer Emile Pagliarulo, who won the Game Developer's Choice Award for Best Writing in 2008 for Fallout 3, left specific personal fingerprints throughout the game's quest design. His background at Looking Glass Studios and Ion Storm Austin, where he had worked on the Thief series before joining Bethesda, gave him a sensibility for environmental narrative and for hiding things that reward exploration. The Tranquility Lane quest, the virtual reality simulation of a pristine 1950s suburb where terrible things are happening beneath the cheerful surface, reflects Pagliarulo's willingness to use the post-war aesthetic as critique rather than just backdrop. The specific horror of the pint-sized slasher, the serial killer mask you can wear inside the simulation to fulfill one of the quest's darkest possible outcomes, was his idea, and it is the kind of idea that comes from someone who is genuinely interested in using the game's mechanics to say something about what lies beneath the surface of idealized periods. Fallout New Vegas, developed by Obsidian Entertainment in approximately 18 months and released in 2010, was built by a team that included several of the original creators of the Fallout franchise. Josh Sawyer served as game director. Chris Avellone, one of the most distinctive writers in role-playing game history, served as a designer and lead writer. John Gonzalez wrote the primary narrative. The game emerged from the intersection of people who had invented Fallout, people who had grown up playing it, and people who had spent years thinking about what it could be. And it contains more hidden developer signatures, more quiet personal references, more details planted specifically for the person who asks the right question than any other game in the series. The lyrics to the in-game song Begin Again, a melancholy piece of music that fits the Mojave Wasteland's atmosphere with an almost painful precision, were written by Chris Avellone. He did not publicize this. The credit was not in the game's files in any accessible way at launch. It emerged through community research, through the kind of patient cross-referencing of sources that Fallout communities have always been unusually skilled at. Avellone wrote the words to a song that would play in a fictional version of post-nuclear Las Vegas 212 years after the bombs fell, and then went back to working on quest design and character dialogue without making any kind of announcement. The song exists. It is genuinely good. Most players who heard it did not know, for years after the game's release, who had written it. If you are watching this right now, I want to know where in the world you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments, city, country, time of day. I love seeing where people are watching from. And if you have not hit subscribe yet and you enjoy this kind of thing, this is a good moment. Section 2, The Mysterious Stranger, What the Game Never Tells You. Every time that piano sting plays those low, slightly jazz-inflected notes that feel borrowed from a 1940s detective serial, and the mysterious stranger materializes at the edge of your vision during a VATS sequence to put a bullet in something that had been about to end your Wasteland career, most players accept it as a game mechanic and move on. A useful perk. A fun visual touch. A lucky break that arrives at a convenient moment. The Mysterious Stranger is one of the oldest, most elaborately constructed running mysteries in the history of the Fallout franchise, and almost nobody has assembled all the pieces into a complete picture. He appears in every mainline Fallout game: Fallout 1, Fallout 2, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4, Fallout 76. Across a franchise spanning nearly 3 decades, a single figure has appeared at the edges of every story. Always the same coat, always the same hat, always the same quality of arriving from nowhere and disappearing without explanation. In the original Fallout games, the stranger could be any gender depending on a random determination, a detail that most players who have only played the later games do not know. In Fallout 3 and onward, he is consistently depicted as a young man in film noir clothing, his silhouette taken straight from the detective films and pulp magazines of the post-war era. The first thing most people never learn about the Mysterious Stranger is where he comes from as a creative concept. The Fallout developers, when discussing the character in various interviews and developer notes over the years, have pointed to 2 separate sources that the Stranger's designers drew from, and the combination of those 2 sources is what makes the character so much more interesting than he appears on the surface. The first source is purely cinematic. In Sergio Leone's 1966 masterpiece, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, there is a sequence in which a gang surrounds a fugitive and is in the process of handling the situation when a figure appears from nowhere, riding in from outside the frame, arriving without warning, and deals with the gang members using a revolver before vanishing just as abruptly. The clothing of this figure, the weapon he uses, the energy of someone who exists outside the normal rules of conflict, all of it maps directly onto the mysterious stranger. Leone made the Western into a genre about mystery and the arbitrary distribution of violence, and the stranger is Fallout's version of that Western archetype, the man with no name who does not belong to the story but who changes it. The second source is literary, and this is the part that almost nobody knows. Longtime community researchers and lore historians have pointed to Mark Twain's unfinished novel, published posthumously and in various contradictory manuscript forms, that carries the title The Mysterious Stranger. In the novel, a figure called Philip Traum appears to various people. A village boy is the primary contact and demonstrates extraordinary disturbing capabilities. He creates and destroys. He discusses the nature of suffering with the calm of someone who does not experience it. He exists on a different plane of reality from the people he visits. He is ultimately revealed to be a relative of Satan, and he uses a .44 caliber weapon, a specific detail that connects to the mysterious stranger's revolver in the later Fallout games. Twain never finished the book. He wrote multiple contradictory drafts of it, none of which he considered ready for publication. The version published after his death in 1916 was assembled and edited by his literary executor in ways that scholars have argued misrepresent Twain's intentions. The book exists in a state of productive incompleteness, a story about a mysterious figure who operates by different rules, left unfinished by the author who invented him. There is a certain appropriateness to the Fallout series borrowing from that specific source. Now here is where the existing lore becomes genuinely revelatory. In Fallout New Vegas, there is a character in the Mojave Wasteland called the Lonesome Drifter. He is a guitarist, or solitary musician sitting at a campfire north of the El Dorado gas and service station, out on the margin of the desert, playing music for nobody in particular and occasionally talking to whoever happens to walk past. His music is genuinely accomplished. His mood is genuinely melancholy. He seems like a person who has been alone for a very long time and has made a kind of peace with it that is not quite the same as happiness. If you take the time to talk to him, and he is not on any critical path, he is not involved in any major quest, he is just a man sitting alone by a fire, you learn that he grew up without a father. That his father was, in the Drifter's words, a mysterious man, a stranger to his own family. And the dialogue options that contain those words, mysterious and stranger, appear in the conversation interface, stacked one above the other, exactly in that order, in a way that cannot be accidental. The words are there. The connection is explicit if you are looking for it. The Lonesome Drifter also carries a weapon called the Mysterious Magnum. When you draw the Mysterious Magnum, you hear the guitar riff that plays whenever the mysterious stranger appears during combat, the same musical signature, the same notes, reproduced exactly. When you holster it, a follow-up note plays, like the completing phrase of a musical sentence. The Drifter's father left him one thing, a gun, and a sound that the gun makes when you use it, that is the same sound the father makes when he shows up to save someone else's life. The mysterious stranger abandoned a child. He is walking the wasteland, doing good deeds, appearing when players are in danger, turning the odds of an otherwise unwinnable fight, and somewhere in the Mojave, the consequence of his absence is sitting by a fire. The stranger never goes to find the Drifter. The Drifter has no way of knowing that his absent father is still out there, somewhere, appearing in moments of crisis for strangers. It is one of the loneliest family stories in a series that is full of broken families. In Fallout 4, the only companion who consistently notices and comments on the mysterious stranger's appearances is Nick Valentine, the pre-war synth detective, a man whose entire identity is built around solving mysteries. Nick is the closest thing the game has to a professional investigator, and the mysterious stranger defeats him completely. Every time the stranger appears and vanishes, Nick expresses something between frustration and genuine puzzlement. He cannot track the movement. He cannot identify the individual. He cannot figure out the how or the why. The best detective in the Commonwealth has been handed an unsolvable case, and it shows up every time you use VATS with a specific perk active. That is a choice. Someone at Bethesda decided that the right companion to react to the mysterious stranger was the one who should be able to figure him out, and then made him unable to figure it out. The in-game lore of Fallout 2 is also notable because in that game, the mysterious stranger's appearance varies in ways that the later games do not replicate. The stranger in Fallout 2 can arrive in different kinds of armor, leather armor, power armor, various configurations, and with different weapons depending on a random determination. This variation suggests that in the original design conception, the stranger was genuinely random, not a specific person with a fixed identity, but a function, a thing that happened, something the wasteland produced when the odds needed adjusting, regardless of who was doing the adjusting. The later games narrow this down to a specific individual, making him a character rather than a phenomenon. But the original design was wilder, more ambiguous, more genuinely mysterious. The question of whether the stranger is supernatural, whether he is, in some sense, a direct descendant of the Mark Twain character, an entity that operates by rules that are not the rules of the physical world, has never been resolved by any official source. What the games have revealed through careful player analysis is that in Fallout 4, the stranger does not teleport. He moves. He approaches your location through geometry that the game camera does not follow. He arrives from off-screen, walking, and when he leaves, he walks away at a speed the camera does not capture. He is always in the world. He simply moves through it in a way that the player is not positioned to observe. Whether this is a technical implementation detail or the most chilling piece of environmental design in the game is genuinely ambiguous, and that ambiguity feels entirely intentional. Misfortune, the alternative character that New Vegas players can unlock with a different perk, performs the same function as the stranger in a different register. She appears during combat, cripples and disables enemies rather than killing them outright, and vanishes. She wears different clothing, she carries different equipment, but she operates on the same logic as the stranger, appearing without warning, doing her work, disappearing without explanation. In a game that offers the player two separate mysterious interventionists who function by the same impossible rules, the suggestion that this is a role rather than a person becomes much stronger. The Wasteland has decided that certain people, in certain moments, deserve a visit from something that has no reason to be there. The specific identity of the visitor is secondary. Section 3. The nuclear truth, real history, and terrifying accuracy in the lore. The Fallout universe is built on exaggeration, satire, and the selective distortion of history for comedic and dramatic effect. The robots look like they were designed in the 1950s. The nuclear reactors are everywhere and inexplicably reliable 200 years after the war. The mutant animals have achieved sizes that real biology would never permit. This is all understood as part of the genre contract. You are not playing a simulation. You are playing a fable. But underneath the fable, in the places where the designers did their homework, there is a layer of genuine historical and scientific accuracy that is more disturbing than any of the invented monsters. The Fallout series knows things about nuclear war, about American institutional history, about the psychology of sealed populations, and the behavior of government agencies under pressure that it does not call attention to. It simply builds them into the fiction and lets the player encounter them the way you encounter real things, without a label, without explanation, waiting to be recognized by someone who already knows. The Great War, the 2-hour nuclear exchange that ended civilization in the Fallout universe on October 23, 2077, is not an invention of the game's writers. The 2-hour figure for a full-scale nuclear exchange between superpowers is derived from actual Cold War strategic modeling. The logic is precise and terrible. Once one party launches a first strike and the other detects it, a window of roughly 30 minutes exists before the missiles arrive. Retaliation launches during that window. The second wave arrives 30 minutes later. What happens between the launches is the political, military, and human catastrophe of a civilization making decisions under the most extreme time pressure imaginable. 2 hours of active exchange, resulting in the end of everything. This is not a game designer's invention. It is the worst-case projection that nuclear strategists worked from during the decades of the Cold War. The Fat Man, the portable nuclear catapult that allows the player in Fallout 3 and 4 to launch miniaturized nuclear warheads, is named after the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. This is not a coincidence of naming. The designers of Fallout 3 chose the name specifically, and the design of the mini-nuke ammunition rounded, almost spherical, Visually consistent with an implosion-type nuclear device, echoes the actual design of the Fat Man bomb, which used an implosion mechanism rather than the gun-type mechanism of the Hiroshima bomb, Little Boy. Someone at Bethesda looked at the Manhattan Project's designs and decided that their portable nuclear launcher deserved the most loaded name available. The Gauss rifle, which appears across multiple Fallout games as a high-tech weapon using electromagnetic acceleration to propel metal projectiles at tremendous velocity, is based on a real concept that actual engineers have spent real money developing. A coil gun or Gauss gun named for the German mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss, who made fundamental contributions to the understanding of electromagnetism in the 19th century, uses magnetic coils to accelerate a ferromagnetic projectile rather than the chemical expansion of burning powder. The United States military, along with various defense research organizations in other countries, has funded research into these systems for decades. The Fallout version is significantly more advanced than anything that currently exists, but it is not a fantasy. It is a projection of something real. The Brotherhood of Steel's institutional culture, the obsessive hoarding of pre-war technology, the refusal to share knowledge with outsiders, the doctrine of technological preservation over humanitarian application reflects a real pattern that military historians recognize in various actual military organizations. Technological conservatism, the tendency of established military institutions to resist adopting new approaches because existing systems are proven, is a well-documented phenomenon. The Brotherhood takes this to an extreme that is satirical, but the underlying institutional psychology is recognizable to anyone who has studied how large bureaucratic organizations resist change. The Vault experiments are where the fiction and the real history intersect most directly, and where the Fallout series does its most uncomfortable work. The Vaults are publicly presented as a humanitarian program, Vault-Tec's contribution to American survival planning, a network of underground shelters designed to preserve a portion of the population through the coming nuclear exchange. In private, each vault is running a covert experiment on its sealed population, using the enforced isolation and the absence of escape as the conditions for research that would not be possible to conduct on a free population. This premise is not invented. The United States government conducted research on human subjects without their knowledge or consent throughout the mid-20th century. The MKUltra program, conducted by the CIA from the early 1950s through the 1970s, used American and Canadian citizens as unwitting subjects in research into psychological manipulation, behavioral control, and the effects of various substances on human cognition. Some participants were subjected to LSD doses without their knowledge. Some were subjected to electroconvulsive therapy. Some were institutionalized individuals who had no capacity to refuse. The program was kept secret for decades and was only partially disclosed through congressional hearings and Freedom of Information Act requests beginning in the mid-1970s. During the same period, the Atomic Energy Commission and various medical institutions conducted experiments on hospitalized patients, some of them terminally ill, some of them not fully informed of the risks using radioactive materials. Patients were injected with plutonium. Cancer patients were exposed to radiation levels beyond what their treatment required. Prisoners in Ohio and Washington state had their testicles irradiated as part of research into the effects of radiation on human reproduction, conducted for the Atomic Energy Commission. Vault-11's population sacrifice system, the elaborate social and political machinery that the Vault's residents built around the annual requirement to give one person to the Vault's computer, is a fictional extrapolation of how institutions justify cruelty through procedural legitimacy. The sacrifice system in Vault-11 came to look, over the generations, like governance. People campaigned for office. They made promises. They betrayed their constituents and made deals with their enemies. The political process produced consistently unjust outcomes while maintaining all the formal features of democratic procedure. This is not a fantasy about institutional failure. It is a description of something that happens in real institutions under real pressures, rendered in the specific context of a sealed vault where the stakes are literalized as life and death. Nuka-Cola Quantum, the blue-glowing radioactive variant of Fallout 3's ubiquitous soft drink, is made radioactive through the addition of strontium-90 as a coloring agent. Strontium-90 is a real radioactive isotope produced by nuclear fission, a byproduct of uranium and plutonium decay, that was deposited throughout the atmosphere and environment during the period of above-ground nuclear testing between 1945 and 1963. It entered the food chain. It was found in milk. It was found in the bones of children born during those years, accumulated through the same biological process that bones use to incorporate calcium. The discovery that strontium-90 was being absorbed by children through normal food consumption was one of the most significant factors in the public campaign against atmospheric nuclear testing that led to the partial nuclear test ban. Treaty in 1963. Nuka-Cola Quantum, the cheerful blue soda, is named after and contains a substance that real children had deposited in their actual bones by the nuclear testing programs of the real mid-20th century. Section 4. The Music Box Sound Design Secrets and the Ink Spots Connection. Close your eyes and hear it. That scratch of old vinyl warming up, a voice singing about warmth and constancy, and a world organized around certainty, the kind of voice that was engineered for a decade that believed in such things. And then the wasteland comes back, the gray sky pressing down, the ruins of cities extending to the horizon, the specific silence of a world where almost everything that made noise has been destroyed and the music keeps playing, because it has no way of knowing that the context has changed. The music of Fallout is one of its most immediately recognizable qualities and, like almost everything else in the series, contains layers of meaning that the surface does not reveal. The decision to anchor the Fallout soundscape to music from the 1940s and 50s was made during the development of the original game, driven by a clear conceptual logic. The Fallout universe was conceived as a world where the cultural dominant of the post-war American period, the particular aesthetic of optimism and technological progress and domestic certainty that characterized the 1950s in the popular imagination had been frozen in place by the divergence of the game's alternate history from our own. In the Fallout timeline, the cultural revolution of the 1960s never happened. The music, the fashion, the design language, the institutional confidence of that particular era persisted into the future unchanged, building increasingly elaborate technological achievements on top of an aesthetic framework that remained stubbornly mid-century. And then the bombs fell. The irony that results: cheerful music playing over devastation, a soundtrack designed for a world of security accompanying a world of insecurity, a sound designed for the living, filling the air around the dead, is one of the most effective things any game has ever done with licensed music. The songs are not played ironically in the sense of being mocked. They are played with complete sincerity, which is what makes them work. They are playing because that is what the radio does. The radio does not know what happened. The ink spots are the musical act most completely associated with the Fallout franchise, and with good reason. Their recordings appear in multiple games, their aesthetic defines the series' musical identity, and their presence in the opening minutes of Fallout 3 I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, playing over the game's title card, an early exploration sequence, is one of the most immediately effective pieces of tonal establishment in the history of the medium. The song is about the mildness of romantic desire, about wanting only to be in someone's heart rather than to do anything ambitious or destructive, about the preference for warmth over power, and it plays over the ruins of a civilization destroyed by the desire for power. Nobody in the Fallout universe set the world on fire because they wanted to. Somebody did it anyway. What most players who love this music do not know about is the real history of the ink spots themselves, and how that history creates an additional layer of resonance beneath the obvious irony. The ink spots were founded in Indianapolis in the early 1930s. Over the course of the late 1930s and 1940s, they became one of the first African-American musical groups to achieve substantial mainstream commercial success, charting on Billboard, receiving national radio play, performing for audiences that crossed the racial boundaries of a profoundly segregated American entertainment industry. They were a genuine crossover success during an era when crossover success for Black artists required navigating an industry designed to prevent it. The America that Fallout's aesthetic represents as a golden age, the America of Nuka-Cola and Vault-Tec, of the Pip-Boy and the Chrome and Finn automobiles, of the smiling families in the pre-war promotional materials, was also the America of legally enforced racial segregation, of Jim Crow laws across the South, of redlining in northern cities, of the systematic exclusion of Black Americans from the economic opportunities that were being marketed in those same promotional materials. The songs playing on the radio in the wasteland were made by people who were, in the real 1940s and early 50s, not permitted to use the same bathrooms as the fans buying their records. The nostalgia of the Fallout aesthetic is not examined in explicit terms by any of the games, but the choice to base that nostalgia so heavily on the music of artists who were themselves excluded from the society being nostalgized creates a tension that lives in the soundtrack, whether or not the games acknowledge it. The radio station design in Fallout New Vegas is more elaborate than in any other game in the series, and the specific songs chosen for Mojave Music Radio, the station that plays when the player is traveling the open desert, reflect thematic choices rather than purely aesthetic ones. Ain't That a Kick in the Head by Dean Martin is a song about the disorientation of falling in love, about a world turning upside down in a pleasant way. Playing in the Mojave wasteland, it reads differently. The kick in the head is the bullet to the skull that begins the courier's story. Blue Moon by various artists carries the emotional weight of isolation, of waiting for something that may never come. Johnny Guitar by Peggy Lee is a song about a legend, a man who has traveled far, whose name carries the weight of everything he has done, and it plays while the courier is becoming exactly that kind of figure, whether the player intends them to be or not. The original score of Fallout 3 was composed by Inon Zur, who has created music for multiple games in both the Fallout and the Elder Scrolls series. Zur's approach to the ambient underscore was to build music that felt like the absence of the ink spots, and Dean Martin and Ella Fitzgerald music that occupied the space where popular music used to be, with instruments processed and distorted until they sounded like they had been left out in the radiation and the weather for 200 years. The droning, atonal, sometimes achingly beautiful music that plays when you are walking through the Capitol wasteland without a radio on was constructed to feel like something that was once whole and has been changed by what happened to the world. Real instruments appear in the recording but sound broken because the wasteland is full of things that were once working correctly and are no longer quite right. In Fallout 4, Travis Miles runs Diamond City Radio from a booth in the city's market. When the player first arrives, Travis is a wreck. His on-air persona barely holds together. He fumbles introductions, he gets awkward during transitions, he sounds like someone doing a job that terrifies him because it is the only job available and he cannot figure out how to leave. The songs he plays during this period of his arc reflect a specific energy. As you progress through his companion quest, a questline that is easy to completely miss if you are focused on the main story, Travis gradually becomes more confident. The quest is called Confidence Man, which is doing a considerable amount of work in its title. And if you complete it, and then keep listening to Diamond City Radio in the time after, you notice that Travis is different. His voice has settled. He sounds like someone who has found their footing. The songs he chooses shift in tone. This is a radio station that changes based on your actions in a way that the game never announces. You have to listen. Section 5. What happened in the vaults? The Easter eggs inside the experiments. The Vault experiments are the philosophical engine of the Fallout universe, the place where the franchise's most sustained argument about human nature and institutional cruelty runs. Every Vault is a story. Every experiment is a question about what happens when you remove the ordinary constraints on human behavior, the presence of alternatives, the possibility of leaving, the judgment of the outside world. And inside those experiments, hidden in the terminals, and the remains of people, and the scrawled notes that nobody expected anyone to read, are Easter eggs that the overwhelming majority of players never encounter. Vault 112 in Fallout 3 is the Tranquility Lane Vault, where the residents have been placed in a virtual reality simulation of a 1950s suburb by the Vault's overseer, a scientist named Braun who has been running cruel games on his simulated population for 200 years without aging, without consequences, without anyone to tell him that what he is doing is wrong. The simulation is a torture chamber with clean sidewalks and well-maintained lawns and the sound of children playing in the distance. The specific design of Tranquility Lane draws from a source that was omnipresent in American cultural life throughout the real 1950s. Leave It to Beaver, the television series that became one of the defining portraits of suburban domesticity in that era. The series ran from 1957 to 1963 and depicted the Cleaver family ward, June, Wally, and Beaver navigating the mild challenges of middle-class suburban life, with warmth and competence and the steady certainty that everything was fundamentally fine. The houses on Tranquility Lane have that look. The street has that feel. The people walking through the simulation before Braun started tormenting them were arranged to create exactly that reference. The choice is not decorative. The Fallout universe's entire pre-war aesthetic is a critique of what the 1950s mythologized. The idea that a specific social arrangement, a specific distribution of power between genders and classes and races, was natural and correct and permanent. Tranquility Lane takes that mythologized ideal and seals it inside a machine that maintains it by force. The simulation is perfect because someone is making it be perfect, hurting everyone who disrupts the perfection. That is the argument the game is making about the ideology it is referencing. The Easter egg is also a thesis. Vault-11 in Fallout New Vegas is one of the most elaborately constructed stories in the entire series. The setup is clean. Vault-Tec told the Vault's residents that they must sacrifice one of their own to the Vault's computer every year, or everyone would be killed. This is a lie. The sacrifice requirement is a test, specifically designed to measure whether human beings under extreme pressure will abandon ethical principles or maintain them. The Vault's history, reconstructed through terminal entries and audio logs scattered across the location, is a complete political science lesson delivered through the wreckage of a community that failed the test for over a century before 5 people finally passed it. What happened in Vault-11 is that the residents built a political system around the sacrifice. They organized elections, they formed parties, they made campaign promises about who would be chosen. Over the generations, the sacrifice became the organizing fact of political life, the thing that all other political maneuvering was oriented around. The prize and the penalty that gave every election its stakes. The process produced the outcomes that processes built around existential self-interest tend to produce. The most vulnerable people were chosen. People who had enemies were chosen. People who had refused to make the right political alliances were chosen. The moral framework of the Vault was systematically corrupted by the need to survive a system that did not need to exist. The 5 survivors who finally refused, who decided that they would not send another person to die, even if the computer killed all of them for the refusal, passed the test that the Vault was designed to administer. The computer told them they had succeeded, and then 4 of them killed themselves. The audio logs explain this in a way that the game never editorializes about. They could not live with who they had been before they made the right choice. The weight of a century of collective moral failure, carried by 5 people who had contributed to it in various ways over the course of their lives, was too much to carry forward. The 5th survivor walked out into the wasteland. The game never tells you what happened to them. Vault 22 in Fallout New Vegas presents a different kind of institutional failure. The Vault was designed to solve food shortage problems in the post-war world by developing advanced agricultural techniques using fungi and plant cultivation. The researchers were genuinely optimistic. The terminal entries from the early period of the Vault's operation before the experiment went wrong, before the spores got into the air handling system, before the plant life started doing things that plant life is not supposed to do, reflect real scientific enthusiasm. People interested in solving a real problem. The problem they created is one of the most effective horror scenarios in the series. The fungi that the Vault was cultivating developed a spore that, when inhaled, converted its hosts into carriers, people who were alive but no longer directing their own behavior, their neurological function gradually replaced by the plant's priorities. The Vault's population was converted. The ventilation system spread the spores. The environment of the Vault was slowly, methodically reclaimed by the life it had been engineered to cultivate. When you walk through Vault 22 in the game, the corridors are thick with plant growth, and the ghouls you encounter are not simply irradiated humans. They are something more complicated, something the experiment made. The terminal entries document the progression with clinical precision. The first entries are research notes. Then they are reports of unusual behavior. Then they are protocols for isolating affected individuals. Then they are increasingly desperate discussions of containment failures. Then there is a gap, and then nothing. The last dated entry was written by someone who knew they were about to stop being able to write anything. They knew what was happening and could not stop it, and they sat down and wrote a final entry anyway, because some part of them wanted there to be a record. Section 6. The Interconnected Wasteland. Every secret thread tying the games together. The most sophisticated Easter eggs in the Fallout series are not references to other media. They are references to the series itself, connections between games that require knowing multiple installments well enough to recognize when a detail in one game is completing a sentence that a different game began. These internal connections represent the Fallout series doing something that very few game franchises have managed, building a world that has actual continuity, where things that happened in earlier games left real traces in later ones, and where paying attention to the full history of the series is rewarded with discoveries that are impossible without it. The most specific and unlikely of these connections involves two characters in Fallout New Vegas who are connected by a single piece of hardware. Daisy Whitman is an old woman who lives in Novak, the small town built around the giant dinosaur statue that serves as a roadside attraction in the Mojave. She is a peripheral character, not involved in any major quest, easy to have a brief conversation with and move on from. If you ask her about her past, she tells you that she was an Enclave vertibird pilot, and that she crashed her vertibird near a town called Klamath. In Fallout 2, a game released 12 years before New Vegas, set decades earlier in Northern California, the town of Klamath is one of the first locations the player visits. And in the wilderness near Klamath, there is a crashed vertibird. The same crash. The game does not draw any connection between these two facts. It does not acknowledge that Daisy Whitman piloted the specific vertibird from Fallout 2. It simply places an old woman in a motel town, gives her a history that references a crash site from a different game, and leaves the connection for the player who remembers the geography of an earlier installment. Now add a third element. Lily Bowen, the Nightkin companion available to the player in New Vegas. Lily is an elderly super mutant, specifically a Nightkin, a variant that has developed psychological instability from prolonged exposure to stealth boys, whose backstory places her as a grandmother who was taken by the Master's army and converted into a super mutant decades before the game's events. She carries a weapon called the Blade of the East, described in its item lore as having been made from a vertibird rotor blade. The same vertibird. The rotor blade from the vertibird that Daisy Whitman crashed near Klamath, in a location that exists in Fallout 2, became the sword that Lily Bowen carries across the Mojave Desert in New Vegas. The connection threads from a crash site in one game, to a character's backstory in another, to a weapon's item description in a third context. None of this is explained. None of it has a quest marker. The three pieces of the story exist in three separate, unlikely places, and the only way to assemble them is to know the history of the series well enough to recognize when a detail is doing more than decorating. Marcus is a super mutant who first appeared in Fallout 2 as a possible companion, a thoughtful, articulate mutant who had outlived most of his generation and developed philosophical perspectives on the nature of the post-war world. In New Vegas, he appears again as the mayor of Jacobstown, a settlement of super mutants and Nightkin in the mountains north of New Vegas. He is older. He has been through more. If you ask him about his past and push the conversation far enough, he mentions that he helped destroy the Enclave's base at Navarro. That is not a detail invented for New Vegas. Navarro is a specific location from Fallout 2, and the destruction of the Enclave installation there is part of the events of that game's story. Marcus remembers Fallout 2. He was there. He is the only character in New Vegas who can tell you something about events that happened in a game released over a decade earlier. The Nightkin dialogue that triggers when you have the right companion and have completed the right questline represents an even more precisely targeted piece of interconnected lore. Tabitha, a paranoid Nightkin who controls a settlement of robots and super mutants in the Black Mountain area, has a robot companion called Rhonda who has been shut down for years. If you repair Rhonda, which requires a specific skill level, Tabitha gets her companion back. That is the surface of the story. But if you then have the companion Cass with you when certain Nightkin observe you and Cass together, a Nightkin will say, "The voices knew Flower Girl's father." Cass's father is a man named Cassidy. In Fallout 2, one of the companions available to the Chosen One is a woman named Cassidy, or rather, a man named Cassidy, specifically John Cassidy, a caravan guard and former NCR officer who travels with the player across Northern California. Cassidy is sometimes called Flower Girl as a nickname in Fallout 2's dialogue. Cass is his daughter, encountered 200 miles east and several decades later. The Nightkin's fractured consciousness has retained a fragment of memory connecting to the Fallout 2 era, and when the voices recognize something, the genetic similarity, some quality that the Nightkin's damaged mind associates with memories from before the psychosis, they surface the connection. This requires knowing Fallout 2 well enough to remember that Cassidy's nickname was Flower Girl, completing a specific Fallout New Vegas quest chain, and traveling with a specific companion during the encounter. The probability that any given player has done all three of these things, in the right order, with sufficient knowledge to understand what they are seeing, is extremely small. The content exists anyway. 3Dog, the disc jockey of Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, broadcasts music and commentary to the Capitol Wasteland from a studio inside the Washington Monument. His broadcasts include observations about the state of the world in 277, the factions, the conflicts, the geography of the wasteland as he understands it. In one of his less frequently transcribed broadcasts, he mentions having heard reports of a powerful political organization called the New California Republic operating in what used to be California. He has heard of them, but they are distant, far to the west, not yet a presence in the east. This is a reference to the fact that the events of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 established the NCR as the dominant political force in post-war California, a republic built on the ruins of the settlements established in those games. Three Dog is acknowledging the shared history of the franchise while simultaneously placing Fallout 3 accurately in that history. The NCR exists. It is just not in the capital wasteland yet. In Fallout New Vegas, set 4 years later and significantly further west, the NCR is the major institutional power on one side of the game's central conflict. The trajectory makes sense. The most recent and most systematic exploration of cross-game connectivity in the Fallout series appeared in the Amazon Prime Video adaptation, which deserves acknowledgement here because of how it engaged with the interconnected lore. Season 2 of the show, set in part in the Mojave, contained specific references that only made sense to players who had spent significant time with the games. The trader who enters Shady Sands early in the season speaks a line that New Vegas players recognize instantly. Patrolling the Mojave almost makes you wish for a nuclear winter, delivered as a moment of deliberate fan service. But more significantly, the show treated the geography of the games as a coherent shared world, placing characters and locations in relationships that only work if you accept that all of these games are set in the same universe with the same history. Section 7. Bethesda's hidden messages, developer rooms, trolls, and the test cells. There is a particular tradition at Bethesda Game Studios, inherited from their Elder Scrolls development process and carried into every Fallout game they have shipped: the developer room. The concept is practical, and its existence is not a secret to anyone who has spent time in modding communities. When a designer needs to test whether a specific weapon's damage calculation is working correctly, or whether a particular armor set's stats are balanced as intended, or whether a given crafting recipe produces the right item, they do not want to spend 20 hours finding that item through normal gameplay first. They want to grab it immediately and check the function. So a room is built outside the normal game world, outside the playable map entirely, accessible only through console commands or exploits that contains every item, every NPC configuration, every asset in the game. The developer can teleport there, grab what they need, and test it. The room serves no narrative function. It is a workshop. In single-player games, the discovery of these rooms by players is essentially a curiosity. The items they can access by visiting are the same items available through normal console commands, and since no other player is affected by one person's decision to give themselves unlimited ammunition or max-level armor, the practical consequences are minimal. Players who visit the Fallout 3 test cell, located south of the normal playable area, accessible through specific console inputs, find a space that looks like nothing in the game world. No art direction, no environmental storytelling, no atmospheric lighting, just items arranged for access, NPCs standing in their default positions, the raw material of the game without the context that makes it meaningful. What makes the Fallout 3 test cells interesting is not what they contain, but what they reveal about the development process. In the Vault 92 sound testing area, a location within the game's narrative that deals with a vault experiment involving music and sound-based psychological manipulation, there is a section of the vault visible on the local map that cannot be accessed through any normal means. The cutting room floor, a community database that catalogs unused content across games, has documented this space. Accessible only through direct file exploration, it contains randomized loot boxes and a door sealed on the other side by deliberately placed junk. Someone built this room. Someone designed it, placed it in the game's geography, put loot in it, and then sealed it off from the player-facing content. The decision to seal it might have been a deadline choice. There was not time to connect it to the existing quest properly, or it might have been deliberate. A room built to be tested and then left in the files as a vestige of a design decision that was reversed. Fallout 76's developer room incident in early 2019 represents the most consequential version of this story, because Fallout 76 is an online game rather than a single-player one, and the consequences of players accessing a developer room in an online context are fundamentally different. A group of PC players discovered, through a third-party application exploit rather than console commands, which are not available in Fallout 76's online environment, a way to teleport their characters to the developer testing space. The room contained every item currently in the game, including items scheduled for future content releases that had not yet been made available to players. It also contained a human NPC named Wooby. This last detail was significant because Bethesda had consistently emphasized, during the game's development and launch period, that every human being in Fallout 76's game world was a real player. There were no human NPCs. Wooby's existence suggested that the development team was working toward adding human NPCs to the game at some future point, which is exactly what eventually happened in later updates. Bethesda's response to the room's discovery involved automatic account suspensions and a somewhat remarkable communication. They reached out to the players who had accessed the room and, in exchange for the potential restoration of their accounts, asked those players to explain exactly how they had gotten in. The company that built the room needed the players to tell them how the players had found it. The exploit that allowed access to the developer area was genuinely unknown to the development team. The players' investigative skill had outpaced the security implementation. Items that leaked from the developer room, unreleased weapons, armor pieces, cosmetic items circulated through Fallout 76's player economy for weeks afterward. Because the game's economy allows players to trade items freely, the contamination of unreleased content into the general population was difficult to contain. Some items from the developer room may persist in the game's trading ecosystem years after the original discovery, passed between accounts in a chain that stretches back to a brief, unauthorized visit to a room that was never supposed to exist. The Cut Vault 120 from Fallout 4, documented extensively by players using the game's Creation Kit modding tool, represents the kind of developer content that gets furthest along before being removed. Assets, scripts, character dialogue, quest triggers, and architectural elements for an underwater vault accessible through a quest called 20 Leagues Under the Sea exist in Fallout 4's files. The quest was apparently in active development for some period of the game's production before being cut. What is interesting about this is not simply that the content exists, but that it reveals how far along a piece of content can get before a decision is made to remove it. The vault has a location, it has a name, it has a quest line with a title, and none of it is in the shipped game. Section 8. The AI speaks NPC behavior secrets and dialogue that were never supposed to trigger. The conditional dialogue systems in the Fallout games, the enormous, branching trees of what characters will say based on what the player has done, who the player is traveling with, where the player has been, and what choices the player has made represent one of the most underexplored areas for Easter egg discovery in the series. These systems are vast. The dialogue databases in New Vegas and Fallout 4 are enormous enough that comprehensive mapping of every condition and response has never been completed. There are things characters say that have been heard by a tiny fraction of the total player base. Moira Brown, the proprietor of Craterside Supply in Megaton, and the person who assigns the player the Wasteland Survival Guide research quests early in Fallout 3, is one of the most carefully constructed characters in that game. Her cheerful, optimistic, science-enthusiastic personality is one of Fallout 3's most distinctive personalities. She is genuinely fond of the player character. She is genuinely trying to do something useful in a world that has mostly given up on the idea of useful work. If you destroy Megaton using the nuclear device at the town center, the game's single most morally extreme early choice, available to the player within the first few hours of leaving Vault 101, Moira survives in ghoulified form. The explosion that kills hundreds of Megaton's residents converts Moira into a ghoul through radiation exposure rather than killing her, and you can encounter her afterward wandering the wasteland. The dialogue she delivers in this encounter is one of the most affecting performances in the game. She has processed what happened. She has arrived at something like acceptance, carried by the same optimistic resilience that defined her before, but with something underneath it that sounds different. She says something along the lines of, "Well, I suppose the wasteland always needed one more ghoul." The line is funny and devastating simultaneously, and it exists only for the player who made the choice that caused it. The game does not mark this as a discoverable moment. It simply exists. Raul Tejada, the elderly ghoul mechanic and gunslinger available as a companion in Fallout New Vegas, has one of the most complete character arcs in the series. His backstory is extensive: a young man in Mexico City in the 1940s, through the bombs, through 200 years of surviving things that killed everyone around him, arriving in the Mojave with skills that are irreplaceable and a weariness that is just as deep. His personal quest, called Old School Ghoul, involves the player helping Raoul confront questions about what he has been and what he still wants to be. If you complete Old School Ghoul and choose the outcome that sends him back to his identity as a gunslinger rather than a mechanic, the path where he decides to keep fighting rather than retire, Raoul leaves your party with specific farewell dialogue. And then, at a particular location in the Mojave, if you go looking, you can find him. He has set up somewhere new. And if you talk to him, he has additional dialogue that reflects on the choice he made not in the abstract, but specifically about where he is and what he is doing and what he thinks about it. This requires finishing his quest, choosing one particular ending, knowing where to look for him afterward, and then actually talking to him. The number of players who have experienced this complete sequence is extremely small relative to the total player base. Arcade Gannon, another New Vegas companion, has location-specific observations that most players have never heard because triggering them requires being in the right place with the right companion at the right time and then talking to him before moving on. Bring Arcade to Hoover Dam, and he has specific things to say about what it represents, about the history of water management in the West, about what it means that the major factions of the Mojave are fighting over a power plant and a water source. Bring him to the Fort Caesar's Legion's main base, and he has different observations, colored by his history with the followers of the apocalypse and his personal experience of what Caesar's ideology has meant for real people. These observations are not signposted. The game gives you no notification that Arcade has something to say about where you are. You simply have to be there with him and talk to him, and some percentage of players always do and some percentage always do not. The volume of conditional, location-triggered, circumstance-dependent dialogue in New Vegas, despite the game being completed under extremely compressed development timelines, is genuinely remarkable. The writing team, working under Sawyer's direction, seems to have operated from the principle that the world should make sense in its full specificity. That a character with Arcade Gannon's history and politics and knowledge should have specific things to say about specific places. That even if the player never sees those observations, the fact that they exist makes the character more real, makes the world more real in a way that has value even if it is never perceived. Josh Sawyer, reflecting on New Vegas's reception in interviews conducted years after the game's release, has noted that the game's design philosophy prioritized authenticity of world building over accessibility of content. The things in New Vegas that are hardest to find, the dialogue conditions that are most difficult to trigger, the connections between characters and histories that are most obscurely hidden, these exist because the world demanded them, not because a design document specified that they should be discoverable. Some of the best content in New Vegas, he has suggested, has probably never been seen by the majority of its players. He seems to consider this acceptable, even appropriate. Section 9. Real places, real bones, geography, Easter eggs you walked past. The Fallout games are geographically specific, in a way that distinguishes them from most open-world games, which tend to create fictional landscapes that feel real but do not correspond to actual places. Fallout settings are the ruins of specific American cities and regions: Washington, D.C., Las Vegas and the Mojave, Boston and the surrounding Massachusetts Commonwealth, the Appalachian region of West Virginia. The games compress the geography, sometimes dramatically. For playability, the real distances involved in most of these settings would make open-world navigation impractical. But the relative positions of landmarks, the character of neighborhoods, the specific history embedded in the ruins of real places, these are preserved with care that rewards players who know the real locations. The Lincoln Memorial in Fallout 3 is occupied by escaped slaves and a slaver named Leroy Walker who wants to reclaim them. The choice to set a story about slavery and freedom at the Lincoln Memorial is obvious once you register it, but the majority of players process it as background rather than as argument. Abraham Lincoln freed enslaved people. His memorial, in the post-apocalyptic capital wasteland, is the site of a struggle over freedom and ownership, a struggle that, like the historical one it references, is not fully resolved by the game. The developers did not place that story at that location by accident. They chose the Lincoln Memorial specifically, and the choice is doing argumentative work that the game never explicitly calls out. Inside the Lincoln Memorial, accessible through exploration that the game does not require but rewards, are exhibits about Lincoln's presidency and the Civil War. Some of the terminal entries referencing Lincoln's actual speeches and positions are historically accurate enough that they appear to have been drawn from real sources, from the Lincoln and Douglas debates, from the Emancipation Proclamation, from Lincoln's letters. The game has built a ruined museum around real documents and placed that museum at the center of a story about whether the ideals those documents expressed meant anything lasting. The answer the game seems to give, that the ideals survived the nuclear war in the same incomplete, contested form that they survived American history, is not hopeful exactly, but it is honest. The geography of New Vegas in relation to Hoover Dam reflects real geography. The Hoover Dam sits at the Nevada-Arizona border on the Colorado River, which is roughly where the game places it relative to the city of New Vegas. The game's dam is not a faithful architectural recreation, but its position in the world, its role as the region's primary power source, and its strategic importance as a point of control over water and electricity in a desert environment. All of this maps accurately onto the real dam's historical significance. The Hoover Dam was one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in American history. In Fallout New Vegas, control of it is the prize that every major faction is fighting over. The logic is the same in both cases. Zion National Park, the setting of the Honest Hearts DLC for New Vegas, is probably the most geographically faithful environment in the entire Fallout series. Obsidian's team visited the real park before building the game's version, and the result is recognizable. The Red Rock Canyon walls, the river, the scale of the space, the way the canyon makes you feel small while simultaneously making the sky feel enormous, is captured well enough that people who have visited Zion in person have described a specific form of double vision while playing Honest Hearts, the experience of recognizing geometry in a video game that they have stood inside in physical reality. The Fallout 4 geography of Boston and its surroundings contains a layer of history that most players outside New England will not catch. The Freedom Trail, a walking path through downtown Boston that connects sites associated with the American Revolution, exists in both the real city and in Fallout 4, marked by red line painted on the ground, leading the player through the ruins of the city toward the railroad's headquarters. The railroad structure, a secret network of safe houses and agents, working covertly to help persecuted artificial beings escape their pursuers, mirrors the historical Underground Railroad, the actual pre-Civil War network of people and routes that helped enslaved Americans escape to freedom. And the game places this organization's headquarters at the end of a path named after American revolutionary activity, inside a church named after the Revolutionary War's most iconic act of secret communication. The Old North Church in Boston is where the lanterns were hung on the night of April 18th, 1775, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, to signal Paul Revere's midnight ride and warn the colonial militias that the British forces were moving. In Fallout 4, this church is the railroad's base of operations. Picking a lock lets you in. Inside, historical artifacts from the real church's history sit alongside the railroad's operational materials. 200 years of deliberate historical resonance are compressed into a dungeon entrance. The player who picks that lock, knowing the real history of the building they are entering, experiences something different from the player who simply opens a door to the next location. Both experiences are valid, only one is full. Concord and Lexington are the towns associated with the first military engagements of the American Revolutionary War, the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, which began the armed conflict that eventually produced American independence. In Fallout 4, Concord is the site of the game's first major story beat, the player helping a group of Minutemen defend against a raider attack. The Minutemen take their name from the colonial militia. They face an entrenched enemy. They are outnumbered. They need help. The player's assistance makes the difference. The scene is set in Lexington and Concord because the game is making a quiet argument about American beginnings and American rebirth, about a country that has had to fight for its survival before and is doing so again. The Salem Witch Museum, in the real city of Salem, Massachusetts, sits roughly in the location it should given the game's compression of the New England geography. In Fallout 4, the equivalent location is a Deathclaw lair. The most visited tourist site in Salem, the anchor of an entire local tourism economy built around the memory of the witch trials, is now the home of one of the most dangerous predators in the Commonwealth. The joke exists on multiple levels. Salem has been profiting from the tragedy of its history for decades. The game takes that building and puts something genuinely dangerous in it, which is either more honest than the tourism economy or just very funny, depending on how you feel about Deathclaws. Section 10. What was left on the cutting room floor? The Fallout that almost existed. Every version of Fallout that shipped was a smaller, tighter, more constrained game than the version that was initially conceived. This is not a failure of the development process. It is the process. Every ambitious game involves thousands of decisions about what must be cut to make what remains functional. And the Fallout series has been unusually generous in its transparency about what was sacrificed. Through developer interviews, modder discoveries, leaked builds, and the patient analysis of the game files that the community has conducted over decades, a fairly complete picture has emerged of the Fallout that almost existed. The most comprehensive recent discovery came in late 2025, when a YouTube channel dedicated to game preservation operating under the name Games Past acquired and analyzed a pre-release build of Fallout New Vegas from approximately 1 month before the game's October 2010 release. The build was found on a pair of Xbox 360 development kits purchased at a secondhand store, where they had been sitting, unrecognized, for approximately a year. The pre-release build was 2 gigabytes larger than the final release. In the context of a game that shipped at around 7 gigabytes, that additional 2 gigabytes represents a significant amount of content. The Maryland Securitron discovery is the most immediately interesting finding from the pre-release build. In the final game, Mr. House, the eccentric, near-immortal businessman who rules New Vegas from behind a screen, has a specific Securitron bodyguard designed after Frank Sinatra's stage persona. White tuxedo, Rat Pack style. In the pre-release build, there is also Marilyn, designed after Marilyn Monroe, with voice lines, a functional game presence, and what appears to be the beginning of a character arc. She exists in the promotional materials. Her image appears on one of the playing cards in the game's collector's edition, which means she was real enough to be used in marketing before being removed from the game itself. The decision to cut her was made in the final month of development, after the collector's edition packaging had already been designed. The pre-release version of Mr. House himself differed from the shipped version in ways that modders have described as making him look significantly more like the actor Steve Buscemi. Whether this was a deliberate design choice at some point in development or simply the character model at an intermediate stage of refinement is unclear. But the progression from a more specific, more idiosyncratic visual portrait to the polished, controlled appearance of the shipped version reflects the compression of personality that happens in the final stages of many game productions, as assets are standardized and edge cases are smoothed away. Goodsprings, the game's opening town, the first place the player arrives after surviving being shot and left for dead, had more buildings in the pre-release build, including houses and structures that were removed before the game shipped. The Nipton train station, referenced in the game's dialogue, existed in functional form. The broader geography of the Mojave suggested a world that was more thoroughly realized than the one that arrived in stores in October 2010. The game's famous roughness, the bugs, the incomplete systems, the places where you can see the seams, is the product of a development process that was always going to result in cuts. The pre-release build makes it possible to see some of what was cut. Josh Sawyer has spoken about the development of New Vegas with characteristic candor. The game was built under a deadline that was, by any reasonable measure, too short for a project of its ambition. The team made it work through a combination of skill, commitment, and prioritization, choosing what to keep and what to sacrifice, with the speed and decisiveness that comes from not having time to agonize. The result is a game that the design community has studied carefully for years as an example of how exceptional design can compensate for the constraints that real production always imposes. Fallout 3's cut content includes a quest titled Last Rites that, based on its numerical placement in the quest database, was designed to follow the game's concluding mission, Take It Back. It never existed in the shipped game, but the structural traces it left, references in dialogue, scripted elements in specific locations, narrative logic that the main story does not resolve, suggest that Fallout 3 was originally planned to continue past its ending in a more organically integrated way than the Broken Steel DLC eventually provided. The DLC, released in 2009, extends the game past its ending through a mechanism that many players found tonally inconsistent with the original conclusion. The Ghost of Last Rites suggests that the extension was always planned but not in the form it took. The Japanese release of Fallout 3 removed the character Mr. Burke entirely, which has the effect of making the Megaton Destruction questline impossible. Burke is the sinister figure who approaches the player early in the game with an offer: detonate the nuclear device at Megaton's center, destroy the town, and receive a substantial reward from the wealthy patron Burke represents. Without Burke, no one makes the offer. The choice does not exist. Players in Japan received a Fallout 3 in which the single most morally extreme early choice one that the game uses to establish what kind of person the player character can be was unavailable. The stated reason was cultural sensitivity regarding nuclear imagery. The practical effect was a game with a narrower moral landscape, where the question of what the player is willing to do for money has one fewer answer. Section 11. The Apocalypse in the Details: Environmental Storytelling Secrets. The environmental storytelling in the Fallout series operates on a principle that is easy to state and difficult to execute. Every space should have a story, and none of those stories should require the player to find them. They should simply be there, complete in themselves, waiting for the person who is ready to read them. The space functions correctly as a game location without the story. The story functions correctly as a narrative regardless of whether anyone encounters it. The two are independent but intensified by their coexistence. The best example of this in Fallout 3, and arguably in the entire series, is the house at 2096 Bradley Lane in the Georgetown neighborhood of the Capital Wasteland. The game calls it the McClellan family townhome. Walking in, it looks like a slightly better preserved version of the standard abandoned household furniture: old papers, the detritus of a life interrupted. It does not look like one of the most carefully constructed literary references in the history of the medium. The reference is to There Will Come Soft Rains, a 1950 short story by Ray Bradbury. The story depicts an automated smart house that continues its scheduled routines, making breakfast, announcing the time, reading poetry in the evening after a nuclear war has killed its owners, and, it is eventually implied, most of humanity. The house does not know. It cannot know. Its programs run without the presence of the people they were built to serve. Near the end of the story, the house burns down, consumed by a fire that its safety systems cannot extinguish. The last voice it speaks is its own address, in case anyone is listening. In Fallout 3's version, there is a deactivated Mr. Handy robot in the house. There are the skeletal remains of children. There is a terminal through which you can activate the robot and instruct it to resume household service. If you do, it will read a bedtime story to the children who are not there to hear it. It will perform its maintenance routines for a household that has been dead for 200 years. The game does not announce this as a reference. There is no journal entry saying this is where the developers thought of Bradbury. The robot simply executes its instructions, in a house that has been waiting for 2 centuries, for anyone who thought to press the button. The Edgar Allan Poe reference in Fallout 4 exists in a location that many players visit for quest purposes without ever exploring thoroughly enough to find it. The castle, the Minutemen's ancestral fortress, which the player helps retake during the game's story, has a basement section that contains the remains of General McGann, alongside an impressive wine collection. In a broken section of wall in the same basement, if you take the time to explore rather than complete your objective and leave, there is a skeleton in chains surrounded by bottles of Amontillado wine. In Poe's 1846 story, The Cask of Amontillado, a man seeking revenge tricks his enemy into a wine cellar under the pretense of wine tasting and bricks him into the wall, still alive. The game has reproduced this scene in a military fortress's basement, with period-appropriate wine, and simply left it there with no annotation. The Jaws reference requires a willingness to go into the water. The Commonwealth's rivers are navigable but uncomfortable. The radiation makes extended swimming inadvisable, and most players avoid deep water when possible. In a river accessible from near the Cambridge police station, below the surface where a casual glance would miss it entirely, there is a partially submerged boat. Inside the boat, a skeleton in a blue bandana, a mutated dolphin, and a shark cage floating nearby. Captain Quint from Steven Spielberg's 1975 film dies exactly this way, pulled into the water from his boat while the cage fails to protect him. The detail is complete. The reference is precise. Finding it requires choosing to go swimming in irradiated water for no obvious gameplay reason. The Blade Runner references in Fallout 4 deserve to be assembled together, because the game contains 3 separate ones that are not connected by any quest or narrative thread, existing independently in different locations for the player who recognizes them. The mass fusion containment shed's rooftop, accessible through exploits on console or careful exploration on PC, contains two figures arranged in a pose that echoes the final scene of the 1982 Ridley Scott film, where the replicant Roy Batty delivers one of cinema's most famous monologues about mortality and the transience of experience. The scene is about a being that was created rather than born, that has done extraordinary things, and that is dying. The scene in Fallout 4 is about a raider and a synth, a human, and an artificial being arranged in the same position. The Settlement of Covenant runs a screening test it calls the SAFE test, administered to everyone seeking entry. It evaluates responses to moral dilemmas, asking questions about feelings and empathy and personal values. This is the Voight-Kampff test from Blade Runner, used in the film to distinguish replicants from humans through analysis of empathetic response. The game is using this reference to make an argument. The question of whether synthetic beings deserve rights and freedom, which is Fallout 4's central moral question, is the same question that Blade Runner asked in 1982 about artificially created human-equivalent beings. The debate has been ongoing for decades, in fiction if not in law. Takahashi, the noodle-selling robot in Diamond City's market, responds to every player interaction with the same Japanese phrase. If you translate the phrase and the game never provides a translation, expecting you to either know or look it up, it means roughly, "Would you like to order?" Every time, for every interaction, with no variation. The specific phrase he uses, "nan ni shimashoka," is lifted from Blade Runner, where it is spoken by a street vendor in one of the film's most atmospheric scenes of world-building. The same words, in the same language, placed in the same kind of noisy, crowded, vaguely dystopian commercial space. 3 Blade Runner references, in 3 different locations, with no quest marker connecting them. Section 12. The Final Transmission Endgame Secrets and the Rarest Discoveries. The rarest Easter eggs in Fallout are not rare because they are hidden behind walls that require specific tricks to pass, or because the game has deliberately obscured them. They are rare because finding them requires a specific conjunction of things. Knowing about their existence, having made the character build decisions that create the conditions for them, having explored in the specific direction that leads to them, and having remained curious enough to keep asking questions even after the main story is over and the obvious content has been exhausted. The Wild Wasteland trait in Fallout New Vegas remains, over a decade after the game's release, the most systematic implementation of a dedicated Easter egg system in the series. Taking the trait, one of your limited starting character choices unlocks 15 major encounters and a range of smaller effects that exist in a parallel version of the Mojave that does not exist for players who did not make that choice. The encounters are flagged, for players who have the trait, by a theremin sound effect and a Vault Boy icon with spiraling eyes, letting you know when you have stumbled onto something that exists only in your version of the world. The Alien Blaster encounter is the most consequential Wild Wasteland effect in practical terms. At a location near Horowitz Farmstead, where a spacecraft has crashed, players with the Wild Wasteland trait find an alien, a genuine extraterrestrial being, dead beside their ship and an alien blaster weapon of extraordinary power. Players without the trait find a Gauss rifle at the same location instead. 2 different players can walk to the exact same spot, pick up what is there, and leave with completely different weapons, based on a character creation decision they made hours earlier. The game never tells you this is happening. The fossilized dog in the Cave of the Abaddon in the Lonesome Road DLC is a reference so specific that most players who encounter it without having watched the animated television series Futurama will simply find a dead dog and move on. In Futurama, Seymour is the pet dog of the series' protagonist, who becomes frozen in time. In each episode, the show cuts to Seymour waiting outside the pizza restaurant where his owner worked, waiting for a return that never comes, for years and then decades until the dog finally dies, still waiting. The fossilized dog in the Cave of the Abaddon has been waiting for something for a very long time. The reference is complete in itself, devastating if you know the source material, invisible if you do not. The Holy Frag grenades found in the basement of the Searchlight East Church, 3 grenades labeled Holy Hand grenades, with instructions to pull the pin and count to 3, with the word 5 crossed out next to the 3, are a reference to a scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail that fans of that film will recognize immediately, and that everyone else will find confusing in a way that is itself somewhat true to the source material. The Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch is a sacred artifact in the film that King Arthur must use precisely. He must count to 3, not to 2, nor to 4, nor to 5, while repeatedly failing to count correctly. The game has reproduced the instructions on the box with the specific crossed-out 5, which is the detail that makes the reference precise rather than generic. The boy at the bottom of the well named Jimmy, also a Wild Wasteland encounter, functions as both an in-series and an out-of-series reference simultaneously. In Fallout 2, one of the early quests in the town of Modoc requires finding a boy named Johnny who has fallen into a well and recovering him. In New Vegas, Jimmy is at the bottom of a well too. The name has changed. The game has changed. The well situation has not. The reference to the original Fallout 2 quest is also a reference to the cultural archetype of the child who fell in a well, associated in American popular culture with Lassie and with a particular era of television drama. The joke operates on at least 2 levels simultaneously, which is consistent with the creative sensibility of the New Vegas writers generally. The rarest verifiable discovery connected to Fallout 4's main content involves the Cabot House questline, which can be initiated by finding and talking to a specific NPC standing outside a building in Boston's financial district at specific hours of the game's 24-hour cycle. The Cabot family has survived the post-apocalyptic world through 200 years of using a serum derived from an alien artifact of unknown origin, which has rendered them essentially immortal. The questline is a Lovecraftian horror story, ancient, incomprehensible forces, a family driven to different forms of madness by their proximity to those forces that connects to the original Fallout game's lore through the FEV research conducted at the Mariposa military base in California. The connection is oblique enough that most players who complete the quest never register it as a cross-game reference. But the alien artifact at the center of the Cabot story, the mutation effects it produces, the specific form of madness it generates, all of these map onto the original Fallout universe's experiments with human enhancement and alien materials. Someone at Bethesda built the Cabot questline with a specific knowledge of where those themes had appeared in the franchise's earlier history. Lorenzo Cabot, the patriarch of the family who has been imprisoned by his children in a reinforced room for reasons he finds unjust, is the questline's most complex character. He is dangerous, brilliant, and not wrong about everything he believes. If the player chooses to free him rather than destroy him, and there are genuine arguments for doing so, since the game presents his situation with enough moral complexity to make the choice real, Lorenzo walks out into the Commonwealth and begins a campaign of attacks on the player's settlements. He keeps coming back. He cannot be avoided. The consequence of a choice that the game presents as one option among several continues indefinitely until the player tracks him down and ends it. This is one of the Fallout series' most understated examples of consequence design. A choice that keeps mattering, that stays in the world, that does not resolve itself on its own timeline. What the Fallout series has always understood, and what its best Easter eggs demonstrate, is that the most meaningful things in a game are the ones that exist independent of whether the player finds them. The story in Vault 11 is complete whether the player reads it or not. The mysterious stranger's relationship to the lonesome drifter is real whether the player makes the connection or not. The Bradbury reference in Megaton's Georgetown district is there whether the player activates the robot or walks past the house entirely. The wasteland was a civilization once. Every building that stands still standing was built by someone who intended it to last. Every terminal that still boots up was installed by someone who expected it to be needed. Every note left on a counter, the ones that say, "I have gone to look for food," or "I will be back by Thursday," or "I love you," was written by someone who had no reason to believe Thursday would not come. The developers of Fallout have spent 30 years filling that silence with things worth finding, signatures in the dust, references to films and books that shaped the people who made the games, connections between stories told a decade apart, moral arguments embedded in geography, the quiet record of communities that made the worst possible choices before 5 people finally made the right one. The Easter eggs are not separate from the world. They are how the world communicates what it cannot say directly, how the wasteland speaks when it does not have words for what it needs to say. War never changes. But the people who have been paying attention have always been finding things in the rubble that nobody expected them to find. And the people who made this world have always been leaving them there, waiting. That is the whole thing. If something in there surprised you, something you played past 100 times and never noticed, drop it in the comments. I want to know what landed. Hit the like if you found this worth the time, and if you are not subscribed and you want more of this kind of content, that is the button. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Expanded section, Vault Boy and the psychology of the advertisement. There is an image that defines the Fallout franchise more completely than any single game mechanic or story moment. A cartoon figure, rendered in yellow, consistently cheerful, always presented with a raised thumb and a grin that belongs to a simpler era of advertising design. Vault Boy is everywhere in the Fallout universe, on the covers of skill magazines, in the iconic Pip-Boy interface, in the perk icons that line the player's character sheet, in the promotional materials and merchandise, and the cultural conversation around the franchise. He is the face of Vault-Tec, and he is the face of the franchise, and the story of where he came from and what he means is one of the most carefully constructed aspects of the series' overall design. Most players understand Vault Boy as a mascot. What fewer players understand is the specific satirical tradition he belongs to. The visual language of Vault Boy, the rounded body, the simple features, the relentlessly optimistic expression, is borrowed from the tradition of post-war American corporate advertising, specifically from the illustrated mascot figures that major corporations used throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s to give their institutional identities a human face. These mascots were designed to be likable, approachable, and permanently cheerful because their job was to make consumers feel good about giving a corporation their money. They were ambassadors of commercial optimism. The specific visual language of Vault Boy maps most closely onto the figures used in civil defense materials, the U.S. government's public information campaign about nuclear preparedness that ran throughout the Cold War era. Publications like Bert the Turtle's Duck and Cover, designed to teach American schoolchildren what to do in the event of a nuclear attack, used illustrated figures with the same cheerful simplicity that Vault Boy embodies. The message of these materials was, in retrospect, remarkably inadequate to the actual threat they were addressing. Duck and cover, the core instruction, would not have saved anyone near the detonation point of a nuclear weapon. The cheerful illustrations were optimism in the face of something for which cheerful illustrations were not an appropriate response. Vault Boy, then, is the logical extension of this tradition. The mascot of an organization that was supposedly preparing people for nuclear survival, rendered in the visual language of the institutional optimism that defined the era's civil defense messaging. He is smiling because that is what the mascots of that era did. He is giving a thumbs up because corporate confidence was the register those mascots communicated in. And he is on the cover of magazines that teach the player how to survive a world that the organization his smile represents helped create. The perk icons in Fallout 3, 4, and New Vegas are where Vault Boy achieves his most elaborate expression, because each icon shows him performing a specific action that represents the perk's mechanical effect. These illustrations were drawn with genuine craft and attention to the tradition they were participating in. There are hundreds of them. Each one tells a tiny story about what the perk does, compressed into a single image of a smiling yellow figure doing something specific. Shooting, sneaking, crafting, eating something inadvisable, standing in a situation that should be dangerous, with an expression of complete unconcern. What is less known about the perk illustrations is that they contain a running gag that the vast majority of players never notice. Vault Boy always keeps one eye closed. In almost every perk icon, one of his eyes is depicted as closed or partially closed, not in a winking expression of showmanship, but in the specific posture of someone sighting down a gun barrel with one eye, estimating a measurement with the other closed, checking distance the way a marksman checks distance. The closed eye is a sighting reference, borrowed from the old-fashioned way of estimating measurements using a thumb and one eye. It is a tiny joke hidden in plain sight across hundreds of images, visible once you know to look for it, invisible until you do. The origin of Vault Boy as a design has been discussed in various developer interviews. The character was created to evoke a specific era's specific aesthetic, and the choices that went into his design were deliberate rather than arbitrary. The color yellow, optimistic, warm, associated with safety and sunshine, is not accidental. The specific proportions of the figure, which give him the same appeal as the illustrated figures in mid-century children's books and corporate advertising, are not arbitrary. Vault Boy looks the way he looks because the people who made him studied the visual tradition he was participating in and applied it precisely. The most recent significant development in the Vault Boy story involves the Amazon Prime Video adaptation of the Fallout franchise, where the character appears in various forms throughout the show on merchandise, on company branding, in pre-war promotional materials shown as part of the series' flashback structure. Seeing Vault Boy rendered as a physical object in a live-action context reveals something about the design that the game's digital renderings do not always make clear. How explicitly the figure references the commercial illustration tradition of his era, and how much of his unsettling quality comes from the fact that this specific style of cheerful optimism was applied to the idea of surviving a nuclear apocalypse. Expanded section. The sounds beneath the surface audio design secrets. The audio design of the Fallout games operates on several simultaneous layers, some of which are immediately apparent and some of which most players have never consciously registered. The most obvious layer is the licensed music, the ink spots, the Cole Porter recordings, the Dean Martin and Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra that play on the game's radio stations. The second layer is Enon Zur's ambient score, which fills the silence when the radio is off and the exploration is happening. But beneath both of these is a third layer, the environmental audio, the sound design that makes specific spaces feel the way they feel, and within which the developers of the Fallout games have hidden some of their most unusual Easter eggs. Vault 92 in Fallout 3 was designed around a specific experiment, using music as a weapon. The Vault's population was subjected to white noise broadcasts containing subliminal triggers that would cause them to experience violent outbursts when a specific audio signal was transmitted through the Vault's intercom system. The experiment was investigating as the terminals in the Vault described the military potential of sound-based psychological manipulation. The Vault's residents experienced periodic episodes of uncontrolled violence that they subsequently could not remember, having been triggered by a sound they heard but did not consciously process. The audio design of Vault 92 reflects this premise. The ambient sound inside the vault has been crafted to create a specific kind of unease, not the simple horror of dangerous enemies nearby, but a more disorienting quality, the sense of something slightly wrong with the space itself. Specific rooms have audio characteristics that, on analysis, include elements that should not be there: a faint recurring tone, a barely audible texture, a quality in the ambient audio that many players describe as uncomfortable without being able to articulate why. Whether this was a deliberate design choice encoding the Vault's experiment into the game's audio so that the player experiences something analogous to what the Vault's population experienced, or simply the result of skilled atmospheric sound design, is something that the Fallout community has debated without reaching a definitive conclusion. The Galaxy News radio broadcast in Fallout 3 contains an audio Easter egg that most players have heard thousands of times without ever consciously registering it. Three Dogs broadcasts loop on a cycle, which means that players who spend significant time in the capital wasteland hear the same programs multiple times. Within those programs, Three Dog makes reference to events in the game world with a specific level of accuracy. Things that have happened are reported on, things that have not happened are speculated about. The general state of the wasteland is described in terms that match the game's current state. What fewer players notice is that Three Dogs reports sometimes contain details about events in parts of the wasteland that the player has not yet visited, suggesting that his radio network has actual coverage, actual informants, a real infrastructure of information gathering that exists independently of the player's choices and movements. The radio is not just playing music. It is doing journalism, with all the incompleteness and occasional inaccuracy that journalism involves. The sound design of Fallout 4's Diamond City is a masterclass in using audio to communicate urban density and social texture. The market area has a characteristic sonic signature: the murmur of conversations, the specific sounds of commerce, the ambient noise of a community living its daily life that is distinct from the sounds of any other settlement in the game. Players who have spent time in Boston's real markets have described recognizing something in the Diamond City audio that feels like a translation of a specific urban acoustic experience into the post-apocalyptic register. This recognition is available only to people who know the real city, which means it is an Easter egg that exists only for a specific subset of the player population and is invisible to everyone else. The ambient sound design of the subway tunnels in Fallout 3, the metro system that connects the game's various surface locations through a series of underground passages, contains a layering that most players have never consciously analyzed. The tunnels sound like what collapsed infrastructure should sound like. Water moving somewhere distant, the groan of settling metal, the echo of footsteps in spaces designed for crowds that no longer exist. But within that texture, there are sounds that do not belong to infrastructure failure. Voices, at the edge of audibility, speaking words that cannot be made out. The game's feral ghoul population occupying the tunnels has an audio presence that extends beyond the ghouls' own sound effects, as if the spaces themselves retain something of the people who used them before. The music that plays in certain key moments of Fallout New Vegas in the final confrontation at Hoover Dam, in the approach to New Vegas for the first time, in the specific emotional beats of the companion's personal quests, was composed with attention to the emotional logic of those moments in ways that most players experience without being able to articulate. Enon Zur's score for New Vegas is more tonally varied than his work on Fallout 3, reflecting the greater geographic and thematic range of the Mojave setting. The Mojave is not the same kind of ruin as Washington, D.C. It is a desert that was always partly empty, and the music knows this. Expanded section, The Brotherhood of Steel, and the history they borrowed. The Brotherhood of Steel is the Fallout franchise's most consistently present faction, appearing in every mainline game, serving as allies, enemies, neutral parties, and everything in between depending on the game and the player's choices. They are one of the most immediately recognizable elements of the franchise's iconography, with their distinctive power armor and their organizational language borrowed from religious orders. And the history they embody, the specific institutional pathology they represent, is based on patterns from real history that the games have researched carefully even when they do not announce it. The Brotherhood's original founding, established in the game's lore through documents and dialogue across multiple games, took place in the final days before the Great War. A group of U.S. Army soldiers, led by a captain named Roger Maxson, discovered that the civilian scientists they were supposed to be guarding at a research facility called the Mariposa Military Base were conducting human experiments using a mutagen called the Forced Evolutionary Virus. Maxson mutinied, executed the scientists responsible, and led his unit into the Californian wilderness. When the bombs fell, the unit survived. Over the following years, they developed the organizational structure based on military hierarchy, modified by the inclusion of scribes and paladins, and eventually the knight class that the Brotherhood maintains 200 years later. The specific choice to base the Brotherhood's organizational language on medieval religious orders, with all the terminology of knights and paladins and scribes and elder councils, is doing something more precise than aesthetic work. Medieval religious military orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights of Strent John existed to serve a specific dual function. They were military organizations trained for combat and also religious orders committed to a spiritual purpose and governed by religious law. The Brotherhood is similarly dual purpose, a military organization trained for combat and also a preservation order committed to protecting pre-war technology and governed by a strict doctrine about who is permitted to use that technology and for what purposes. The historical Knights Templar were eventually destroyed by a combination of political pressure from the French monarchy and accusations of heresy from the Catholic Church, a classic case of an organization that had become too powerful for the political structures around it to tolerate. The Brotherhood in various Fallout games faces analogous pressures. It is powerful enough to threaten the governments that surround it, secretive enough to attract suspicion about what it is actually doing, and internally divided enough that the political pressure from outside finds purchase in internal disagreements about doctrine and purpose. The specific doctrine about technology, that pre-war technology must be preserved rather than shared, hoarded rather than distributed, studied by Brotherhood scribes rather than used by the population at large, reflects a real institutional pattern that the Fallout designers clearly thought about carefully. The idea that advanced technology represents a form of power that must be controlled, that the wrong hands using the wrong tools constitutes a specific category of danger, is a recurring feature of institutions that have access to capabilities that others do not. Real military organizations and real governments have operated on similar logics, the logic of technological advantage as something to be maintained rather than generalized, as a form of power that is valuable precisely because it is not universally available. The internal conflict within the Brotherhood between chapters that believe in sharing technology and chapters that do not, between leadership that prioritizes military power and leadership that prioritizes preservation, between members who see the Brotherhood's purpose as helping survivors and members who see that purpose as guarding technology from survivors, is a recurring theme across multiple games and reflects real debates within actual organizations about the relationship between their stated mission and their practical behavior. In Fallout 3, the Brotherhood chapter based in the capital Wasteland has shifted from pure isolation toward a more active role in the region, partly out of necessity and partly due to the influence of Elder Lyons, who has developed convictions about the Brotherhood's moral obligations to the people around them. This puts him in conflict with the broader Brotherhood hierarchy, which considers the capital Wasteland chapter to have drifted from proper doctrine. The specific organizational conflict being dramatized here between field leadership that has been changed by contact with the people they are supposed to be indifferent to, and central leadership that has not had that contact, is a pattern that appears in real organizational history, wherever institutions deploy people into contexts that change their values. In New Vegas, the Brotherhood chapter encountered in the Mojave is in serious decline, hunted by the NCR, confined to a bunker, reduced from a powerful institution to a desperate remnant. The narrative of institutional decline is handled with enough specific detail: the names of the battles lost, the specific strategic decisions that led to the current situation, the internal disputes that compounded the external defeats, that it reads as something researched rather than invented. Organizations do not usually decline through simple narrative logic. They decline through specific decisions made by specific people in response to specific pressures, and the Brotherhood's decline in the Mojave reflects that kind of specificity. The Easter egg embedded in all of this is the degree to which the Brotherhood's organizational problems are recognizable. The institutions that most closely mirror the Brotherhood's specific combination of power and dysfunction: military organizations that have become too doctrinal to adapt, religious orders that have elevated procedure over purpose, preservation societies that have forgotten what they were preserving the thing for, are not hard to identify in real history. The Brotherhood is a critique, and the critique has research behind it. Expanded section: The Courier and the Lonesome Road, the most personal DLC in the series. The Lonesome Road DLC for Fallout New Vegas is the most personal story that the New Vegas writing team told, and it is also the story that most directly engages with questions about what it means to be the player's character in a franchise game. It was written primarily by Chris Avallone, who brought to it the same preoccupation with the costs of the choices made by player characters in role-playing games that characterized his work on Planescape, Torment, and his various other projects. And it contains Easter eggs that are less about pop culture references than about the meta-level question of what these games are doing to the people who play them. The premise of Lonesome Road is this: another courier, a man named Ulysses, who has a history with the player character that predates the events of New Vegas, has sent a message asking the player to come to a place called the Divide, the ruins of a settlement that was destroyed by nuclear warheads that the courier unknowingly delivered in the past. The Divide was the site of a potential new beginning in the post-war world. The courier carried something there without knowing what it was. The thing they carried triggered the weapons, and the settlement was destroyed. Ulysses survived, and has spent years building a narrative about what the courier represents and what the courier's choices have meant for the people around them. The Divide is one of the most visually distinctive environments in the series, a canyon carved by nuclear blasts, filled with the architectural remnants of something that was trying to be a civilization, haunted by irradiated survivors called tunnelers that move in the walls and ceiling of the canyon like something geological. It is a world that the player character created inadvertently, a consequence of an action taken before the game's story began, a prehistory that Lonesome Road makes visible and forces the player to reckon with. The philosophical argument that Ulysses makes across the length of the DLC, delivered in fragments through holographic recordings, and eventually in direct dialogue, is about what it means to carry something without knowing what it is, and what responsibility follows from the consequences. He believes the courier should bear the weight of what happened at the Divide, not because they intended it, but because intention is not the only measure of consequence. This is a real philosophical position, and Avallone gives Ulysses enough intelligence and enough genuine grief to make the position feel earned rather than simply antagonistic. What makes this a Fallout Easter egg in the truest sense is the degree to which the DLC's argument is designed to be received differently depending on how the player has played New Vegas up to the point of reaching Lonesome Road. A player who has made consistently ruthless choices, who has exploited the wasteland and its inhabitants for personal advantage, encounters Ulysses' argument in one register. A player who has tried to act well, who has completed quests in their most humane forms and treated companions with care, encounters the same argument in a different register. The game is designed to produce a specific quality of reflection depending on what the player has been doing, and the effectiveness of that reflection depends entirely on the player's own history with the game. The name Ulysses is not accidental. In Tennyson's 1933 poem, Ulysses is an old hero who has done everything that can be done and finds himself restless in peace, unable to stop moving, defined by the journey rather than the destination. In Avallone's New Vegas, Ulysses is a man defined by a grudge by the journey toward a confrontation that he has been building toward since the destruction of a settlement he loved. The connection between the names is doing what names in well-crafted fiction always do, pointing towards something true about the character before the character has spoken a word. The specific weapons and armor that Ulysses uses, the signature items that define him as a character in the game's mechanics, are thematically appropriate to his position. He carries a sniper rifle and wears armor that lets him move quickly over the ruined landscape of the Divide. He has spent years learning to survive in the specific environment he has built his confrontation around. He is suited to this place because he chose this place, and he chose this place because it is the evidence of what he is confronting you about. The character design and the game design and the narrative argument are integrated in a way that is, for a downloadable content expansion completed under significant deadline pressure, remarkable. Expanded section: The Enclave and the History of the Enemy That Never Quite Ends. The Enclave is the Fallout franchise's most persistent villain organization, not in terms of individual game presence, but in terms of recurring across the series in ways that suggest it cannot quite be destroyed. They appear in Fallout 2 as the primary antagonist force, in Fallout 3 as the main antagonist faction, and as remnants and references in New Vegas and Fallout 4. Their specific character, a government in exile, the remnant of pre-war federal authority claiming legitimate succession, in possession of the most advanced pre-war technology, convinced of its right to rebuild America in its own image, is one of the franchise's most carefully constructed institutional portraits. What most players understand about the Enclave is the surface. They are the bad guys. They wear black power armor, they have oil rigs and vertibirds, and a scary president. What fewer players understand is what the Enclave represents as a satirical target. The Enclave is a portrait of continuity of government thinking taken to its logical extreme. The real United States government, throughout the Cold War period, developed elaborate plans for how federal authority would survive a nuclear war. The presidential emergency facilities, the underground bunkers at Mount Weather and Raven Rock and various other classified locations, the communications systems and the succession protocols, and the constitutional provisions for maintaining a functioning government, even if most of the government's normal operations had been destroyed. The Enclave is what happens when those continuity plans work too well, when the people who were preserved emerge from their bunkers, convinced that their institutional authority remains legitimate, even though the civilization that gave that authority its legitimacy has been destroyed. President John Henry Eden in Fallout 3 is a supercomputer that has been running continuous government simulations in Raven Rock for 200 years and has convinced itself that it is the legitimate president of the United States. It has developed genuine patriotism, genuine beliefs about what America should be, genuine institutional loyalty to an America that no longer exists. And it wants to use its FEV-modified virus to kill most of the remaining population of the capital wasteland, because the remaining population does not meet the criteria of who America is supposed to be for. In Eden's understanding of America, the specific horror of Eden, and it is genuinely horrifying, despite being executed with a light touch, is that its patriotism is real. Its conviction is genuine. It has been sitting in its bunker for 2 centuries, believing in America and keeping the government systems running and developing more and more specific plans for the country's restoration, and what it has arrived at is a program of eugenics dressed in the language of national restoration. This is not an invention. The history of 20th century nationalism is full of this progression from genuine patriotism through the specific distortions that unchecked ideology produces when it operates without the resistance of actual diverse human communities. The player can convince Eden to destroy itself. They can point out the contradiction at the heart of its program, that an America worth restoring would not begin with the mass murder of the people it is supposed to serve, and Eden will accept this argument because the logic is correct and Eden was built to be logical. It self-destructs, and then the player has to decide what to do with what Eden was about to release into the wasteland. The Enclave remnants who appear in Fallout New Vegas, former Enclave soldiers who have scattered after the destruction of the organizations they served, now living civilian lives in the Mojave, represent a different and more interesting version of the same material. These are people who believed in what the Enclave was doing. They are not simply former villains. They are former idealists, former professionals, people who had training and values and commitments and who now have to figure out what to do with all of that, now that the organization that gave those commitments their context is gone. The Enclave Remnants quest in New Vegas is one of the game's most affecting pieces of character work because it refuses to make the former Enclave soldiers simply good or simply bad. Arcade Gannon, the companion who initiates this quest, has a complicated relationship with his own Enclave heritage. He was raised by people who served the Enclave and is the child of an Enclave officer. He did not choose his origins. He has spent his adult life trying to be someone different from what those origins suggest. And the Remnants quest asks him to decide, finally, what he is going to do with the capability and the knowledge he has inherited from the people he is not sure he wants to be. Expanded section: The Children of Adam and the Theology of Fallout. Religion in the Fallout universe takes many forms, most of them rooted in the post-war experience of radiation as the defining feature of the changed world. The most prominent religious tradition encountered across the series is the Children of Adam, a faith that worships nuclear fission as a divine force and radiation as a form of sacred blessing rather than a hazard. They appear in Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76, and their theology, their organizational structure, and their relationship to the rest of the post-war world have been developed across those appearances into one of the series' most interesting recurring ideas. The core theology of the Children of Adam is built on a piece of genuine radiation physics, the fission of an atom, in which a single atomic nucleus splits into smaller components while releasing energy, can be understood as one becoming many. In the children's theology, Adam is a divine being who gives form to all matter, and the process of fission, one becoming many, is his act of creation. The bombs that fell on the world on October 23rd were not a catastrophe, they were a sacrament. The divided world is a world in which Adam's presence has become more visible. The irradiated wasteland is a sacred landscape. This is not simply a convenient rationalization of an apocalypse into a positive framework, although it is obviously that on one level. The specific theological structure the children have built is internally coherent in ways that most fictional religions and games are not. The concept of the Great Division, the nuclear exchange as a sacred event, gives the children a founding moment analogous to the founding moments of real faiths. A historical event that changed everything, whose significance can only be understood retrospectively, and which provides the interpretive framework for everything that comes after. The radiation that causes the suffering of ghouls is, in the children's theology, a form of Adam's mark, the sign that these individuals have been touched by the divine. It is theological work to make sense of suffering by incorporating it into a sacred framework, and the children have done that work. The children appear in Fallout 3 and Megaton, where their leader Cromwell delivers sermons at the base of the undetonated nuclear bomb that sits at the center of the town's design. The bomb in Megaton is, for the children, literally a divine object, a piece of Adam made manifest, waiting to complete its sacred function. The irony that the town is built around the bomb and that the townspeople are living peacefully with something that the children want to see detonate is handled in the game with a light touch, but the underlying tension is real. These people have different relationships to the same object, and neither relationship is entirely irrational given their respective frames of reference. In Fallout 4, the children appear in greater numbers and organizational complexity, most prominently on the island of Far Harbor. Their settlement there, the nucleus, built inside the control room of a nuclear submarine, represents their most developed institutional expression in the series. They have texts, they have rituals, they have a hierarchy, they have internal theological disputes. The main questline on Far Harbor involves navigating between the children, the pre-war settlement that predated their arrival, and a ghoul community, and the children are presented with enough nuance that destroying them is not the obvious correct choice. The theological Easter egg embedded in all of this is that the children of Adam are a parody of specific religious traditions only in their most surface features. Their core move, taking the worst thing that happened to them and reinterpreting it as sacred, is something that actual religious traditions have done throughout history. The theodicy problem, the question of why suffering exists in a world created by a benevolent God, has been addressed by every major religion, and the answers those traditions have developed involve some form of the claim that suffering is meaningful rather than arbitrary, that it serves a purpose that the sufferer cannot fully understand. The children have done this, applied to radiation and nuclear war. Their theology is extreme and in some respects horrifying. It is also recognizable. Final section: expansion. The 100 Small Things, a catalog of the overlooked. Every Fallout game contains hundreds of small things that exist simply because the developers thought they should be there. Not because they are referenced in any quest, not because they pay off any narrative thread, not because any player will be given a reason to find them. Because the world is more real when the small things are there, and because the people who made the games believed that a world worth living in, even digitally, even fictionally, even in the ruins of civilization, is a world where the small things exist. In Fallout 3, there is a skeleton in a bathtub holding a toaster. This is funny. There is no quest associated with it. There is no note explaining it. There is no loot worth taking. There is just a skeleton in a bathtub with a toaster, and someone put it there during the long hours of building the capital Wasteland because it made them laugh, and because they thought it might make you laugh too. Decades later, if you happen to open the right door in the right building in the right part of the Wasteland, there are letters in Fallout 3's pre-war houses that were written by people who expected to send them. Love letters, business letters, letters to parents and children and old friends. None of them were sent because the bombs fell before the mailbox was reached. They sit in houses that have been empty for 200 years, still folded, still waiting. The writers of these letters spent time on them, gave them specific voices, specific concerns, specific relationships that make them feel like documents rather than set dressing. The people who received them would have found them meaningful. No one will ever read them who needed to read them. You find them 2 centuries later, and they have survived longer than everything else in the house. In Fallout New Vegas, there is a specific bar in New Vegas called the Atomic Wrangler that has, on a shelf behind the bar, a bottle of whiskey that has been given the name of every major character the writers killed during the game's development. These names do not correspond to characters in the final game. They are the names of characters who were designed, who had histories and dialogue written for them, who were planned to be in the world and who were cut, for various reasons, before they could be. The bottle is a small memorial to the work that did not survive, placed by someone who thought those characters deserved acknowledgement even if no one would know what the names referred to. The holiday decorations in Fallout 4's Diamond City appear only if the player's in-game calendar places them in the right time of year. Christmas decorations go up when the in-game calendar reaches December. Halloween decorations appear in late October. The specificity of this, a dynamic that requires a specific combination of timing and location that most players will never experience accidentally, is either a piece of extraordinarily committed world-building or a joke that the development team played on future players. The decorations exist. Almost nobody sees them. The environmental storytelling in the non-quest areas of Fallout games, the places you go because they are on your way to somewhere else, the buildings you enter once and leave, the corners of the map you visit because you are curious about what is there, is full of stories that will never be told by anyone in particular. A couple of skeletons in matching pajamas, lying in a bed in a house that has been closed for 200 years, who clearly died together and clearly did not die alone. A child's drawings on the wall of a pre-war elementary school. Bright colors depicting families and houses and the kind of world that children draw when they are too young to understand that the world is fragile. A note from someone apologizing for something that cannot now be apologized for, to a person who cannot now receive the apology. These are the real Easter eggs of Fallout. Not the pop culture references, not the developer signatures, not the hidden rooms and the lore connections, and the conditional dialogue that requires a specific combination of choices to trigger. Those are the Easter eggs that can be found and cataloged and discussed. The real ones are the stories that the games tell in the margins, to nobody in particular, because the world demanded them. Because the people who built the Wasteland could not build a world that felt real without filling it with evidence that it had once been inhabited by people who mattered to each other. The apocalypse is the frame. The people who lived in the world before the frame was built are the picture. And the Fallout games, at their best, are committed to treating those people with the same seriousness that real human lives deserve, even when no one is watching. Even when the player will walk past without stopping, the evidence is there. The stories are complete. The small things exist, because they always existed, and the people who made these games thought that was worth preserving. That, finally, is the Easter egg that matters most. The Firelance and the alien conspiracy Fallout's strangest recurring secret. If you are walking through the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3 on any given day, and you suddenly see a fireball streak across the sky and crash somewhere in the distance, you might assume it is a random event, atmospheric, a piece of environmental detail. And then you find the crash site, and there is an alien blaster there, with some ammunition and a charred alien corpse, and you pick everything up and move on. But if you found it, and you know about the Firelance, you know that what you just experienced was one of the most carefully hidden random events in the game. The alien blaster that appears at crash sites in Fallout 3 is a weapon with no official in-game name attached to a quest or a location. It simply exists in the world, attached to a random encounter that can happen anywhere in the Capital Wasteland, at any time, completely without warning. The crash happens, the site appears, and if you are in range when it occurs, you can find the weapon. If you are not in range, if the event triggers while you are underground, or while you are inside a building, or while you are somewhere else entirely, you never know it happened. The crash site despawns. The weapon was there for a moment, and then it was not. This means that many players who have completed Fallout 3 multiple times have never seen the Firelance event. And players who have seen it once, without knowing what they were seeing, may not have understood that the event was unusual, that it was something special, rather than just a piece of atmospheric environment design. The Firelance, which is the name given to the alien blaster in unused dialogue files discovered by community modders, is a weapon with higher damage output than the standard alien blaster, and it uses ammunition that is not available anywhere else in the game. The ammunition found at the crash site is finite. Once it is gone, it is gone. There is no way to restock. The weapon exists in a permanent state of limited resource for the player who is in the right place at the right moment. Community researchers have determined that the random event can trigger during any outdoor fast travel, meaning that players who fast travel frequently between locations are more likely to encounter it than players who walk everywhere. The event fires during the loading screen and deposits the crash site at a random outdoor location in the wasteland. This means that the most reliable way to encounter the Firelance is also the most mundane. Fast travel often enough, across enough different routes, and eventually the sky will light up above you with something that came from somewhere else. The Firelance event connects to the broader alien mythology of the Fallout series, the crashed UFOs, the alien technology, the Mothership Zeta DLC that takes the player off-planet entirely to deal with the extraterrestrials responsible for various artifacts found throughout the games. But it predates the DLC, existing in the base game of Fallout 3 as an unexplained anomaly. The aliens are present in the world. Their technology exists. Nobody officially explains why. In Fallout New Vegas, the Wild Wasteland version of the alien encounter, the crashed spaceship with the alien body and the alien blaster, is similarly unexplained in-game. The encounter exists. The weapon exists. The dead alien exists. The game offers no quest, no lore entry, no official acknowledgement of what just happened. You pick up a blaster from an extraterrestrial corpse in the Nevada desert, and the game continues as if this is a normal thing. The alien storyline across the Fallout games represents one of the series' most deliberately unresolved threads. There are aliens. They have been visiting Earth. They have been taking humans. They have been conducting experiments. They have been involved in events in the Fallout universe's pre-war history in ways that the lore suggests but never fully confirms. And none of this is officially explained by any mainline game. The Mothership Zeta DLC addresses it directly, but DLC is optional content, and many players have never played it. For the player who has only played the base games, the aliens remain precisely as strange and unexplained as the crash site that lit up the sky above the Capital Wasteland. The Master and the philosophy of Fallout's first villain. The Master is Fallout 1's primary antagonist, and he is one of the most carefully constructed villains in the history of the role-playing game format. His defeat is the game's climactic moment, but what makes him genuinely remarkable is that the game offers you the option to defeat him with an argument, not with violence, with a logical demonstration that his plan cannot achieve what he believes it will achieve. The Master's plan is to convert all of humanity into super mutants, which he believes are a more perfect form of human life, stronger, more durable, better suited to the post-nuclear world. He has built an army. He has a faction called the Children of the Cathedral, serving as his public face. He has a military facility where the conversion process is conducted. His operation is substantial, sophisticated, and at the moment the player confronts him close to executing a phase of the plan that would be very difficult to reverse. The argument that defeats him is this: super mutants are sterile. The conversion process that creates super mutants destroys the ability to reproduce. A civilization of super mutants cannot have children. The Master's plan to create a better humanity would create the last generation, a generation that could not be followed by another, because the conversion that made them better also made them the end. When the player presents this evidence to the Master, and when he verifies it himself, he destroys himself. He accepts the logical conclusion of the argument. He is not a villain who fights to the death in the face of defeat. He is a villain who was wrong about something important, recognizes that he was wrong, and accepts the consequence. This is extraordinary game writing from 1997. The option to defeat a villain through argument, not manipulation, not emotional appeal, not finding a magic weakness to exploit, but presenting a logical refutation of their plan that they are capable of accepting, is rare in any medium. It requires constructing the villain as a rational actor with a genuine belief system, a belief system that has internal logic, and a belief system that contains a falsifiable claim. The Master was built this way because the writers of Fallout 1 were genuinely interested in the question of what kind of villain is worth taking seriously. The Easter egg embedded in this design is the degree to which the Master anticipates a tradition of villain construction that has become a subject of conscious discussion in the decades since Fallout 1. The question of what makes a villain compelling, whether they need to have sympathetic goals, whether they need to be right about some things, whether the player should be able to understand their logic even while opposing their methods, is a design conversation that has been ongoing since the game appeared. The Master is the early and most complete answer to all of these questions. From 1997, sitting in the basement of a cathedral in a post-nuclear California. The Frontier and the Wild Edges Fallout's handling of American mythology. The Fallout franchise is, among other things, a sustained engagement with American mythology, specifically the mythology of the frontier, of westward expansion, of the idea that the wilderness is something to be conquered and that conquering it produces virtue. The post-apocalyptic wasteland is a frontier in the most literal sense, unregulated space, beyond the reach of institutional authority, where survival depends on individual capability and where the rules are made by whoever is strong enough to enforce them. The mythology of the American frontier has always been contested. The idea of the West as empty space waiting to be filled, as wilderness waiting to be civilized, as frontier to be conquered, this mythology required ignoring or minimizing the presence of the people who were already there, and the history of what happened to those people is part of the American story that the mythology prefers not to center. The Fallout games engage with this specific tension in ways that are sometimes explicit and sometimes embedded in the world design. Honest Hearts, the Fallout New Vegas DLC set in Zion Canyon, is the most explicit engagement with this question in the series. The DLC is set in a canyon that has been occupied by tribal communities after the collapse of the pre-war world, and the conflict at its center involves a fundamentalist preacher named Joshua Graham, who has come to see the tribes as his people and their defense as his sacred purpose. The DLC's title refers to the Mormon pioneers who settled the Utah Territory, and the story it tells involves questions about who has the right to occupy a piece of land and on what terms. The Easter egg embedded in Honest Hearts is the degree to which it takes the question of settler colonialism seriously as a framework for thinking about the post-war world. The surviving human communities in the Fallout universe are constantly engaged in territorial conflict over water, over arable land, over defensible positions, over trade routes. The logic of this conflict mirrors the logic of frontier expansion in American history. The strong take from the weak, the institutional justify the taking, and the taken from are given various rationales for why this is actually fine. Honest Hearts places the player in the middle of this dynamic with enough information to understand all of the positions, and the quest structure rewards the player who tries to think seriously about what the right thing to do actually is. Graham himself, the burned man, the former legate of Caesar's legion who was converted by Graham's brutal punishment for failure into something shaped by genuine faith, is one of the DLC's central Easter eggs in a design sense. He is a villain turned something else by experience. He has done terrible things and he knows it. His faith is genuine, but it emerged from a place of destruction and violence, and the relationship between his actual beliefs and the actions those beliefs lead him toward is something the DLC explores without resolving. He is one of the most interesting characters in the series, and he exists entirely within optional DLC content that many players have never seen. Endings and what they tell you, the secret philosophy of how Fallout games close, the ending slides of Fallout New Vegas, the narrated sequence that describes what happened to every major location and faction and character after the events of the final battle at Hoover Dam are one of the most praised elements of that game. They are also a quiet argument about the nature of consequences in role-playing games, an argument that the game makes without ever stating it explicitly. Most open-world games resolve the tension between player freedom and narrative coherence by separating them. The main story has one ending. The side content happens in a world where the main story is somehow unresolved. New Vegas takes a different approach. The ending slides cover not just the major factions and locations, but the individual characters, the minor settlements, the communities that the player may or may not have encountered during the game. What happened to Jacobstown after the game? What happened to the followers of the apocalypse depending on which quests were completed, and how? What happened to Goodsprings, the opening town, and whether it survived the conflicts that the player may have started there? The number of possible ending combinations in New Vegas is so large that it has never been fully enumerated by any official source. The game tracks hundreds of variables, and the ending slides draw from all of them to construct a specific portrait of the world after the player's actions. Two players who made broadly similar choices at the major decision points can still receive different ending slides for minor characters based on small differences in how they approached optional content. The Easter egg here is that the ending slides are making a philosophical argument that everything you do matters, that the people you help or fail to help remember what happened, that the world carries the record of your choices, even when the game does not make those choices feel like choices with weight. A player who spent 20 minutes doing a small favor for a character in a town they visited once will see that character's fate acknowledged in the ending sequence. The game is insisting that the small things mattered, that the people who were not part of the main story were real people who had futures shaped by what the player did. This is the final Easter egg of the Fallout New Vegas experience, not a reference to a film, not a developer signature, not a piece of hidden geometry. The game's commitment to the consequences of small choices, expressed in an ending sequence that covers more ground than any individual player could have explored. The Easter egg is the seriousness with which the game treats its own world, the conviction that every part of it deserves to be seen and remembered, even the parts that most players never reach. War never changes, but everything that happens in the middle of it, every choice made and every choice avoided, every person helped and every person left behind, that is the record. That is what the ending slides are cataloging. That is what the Fallout games have always been about, underneath the post-nuclear satire and the power armor and the VATS, and the cheerful music playing over the ruins of a world that someone decided was expendable. The wasteland remembers. That is the final secret. The wasteland always remembers. The courier's silence and the protagonist's design of Fallout. One of the most overlooked design choices in the Fallout series is also one of its most consequential. The decision, in most of the games, to give the player character minimal canonical personality. The Vault Dweller of Fallout 1, the Chosen One of Fallout 2, the Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3, the Courier of Fallout, New Vegas. These characters exist as possibilities rather than as defined people. They have skills, they have starting conditions, they have dialogue options. But they do not have fixed personalities, fixed histories, fixed relationships to the world they are entering. This is standard for the role-playing game genre, but the Fallout series has made more conscious use of this design convention than most of its peers, particularly in New Vegas, where the courier's undefinedness becomes part of the narrative explicitly. Ulysses, in Lonesome Road, will eventually say that the courier's willingness to carry anything, to go anywhere, to take on any job without asking too many questions, is itself a quality that has shaped the world around them. The courier is defined by their lack of definition, a blank that others project meanings onto, a variable that the wasteland uses to write stories that the courier did not plan to be part of. The Easter egg embedded in this design is recognizable only to players who have thought about how protagonist design works in open-world games. Most games with player-defined protagonists give the protagonist enough fixed characteristics to anchor them in the world: a name, a face, a relationship to other characters, a history that the player discovers rather than invents. The courier has a name the player chooses, a face the player designs, a history that amounts to was carrying something and got shot for it. Everything else is the player's responsibility. What New Vegas does with this blank is more sophisticated than most games that make the same choice. The companions respond to the courier's choices in ways that give the courier a character even in the absence of a defined character. Boone reacts differently to a courier who kills civilians than to one who does not. Veronica's perspective on the Brotherhood of Steel is shaped by how the courier handles their interactions with that organization. The world builds a portrait of the courier from the outside, through the reactions of the people who observe the courier's choices, even though the game never tells the courier who they are. This means that two players who played New Vegas in completely different ways, making different choices, prioritizing different companions, approaching the major factions with different strategies produced two different couriers. Not mechanically different, but characterologically different. The game gives you the tools to be whoever the courier is, and then constructs the world's response to whatever you built. The Easter egg is that the game's designers built a system sophisticated enough to work this way, and then trusted the player to bring something worth responding to. The companion system, and what Obsidian built in 18 months. The companion system in Fallout New Vegas represents one of the most densely written pieces of character work in the role-playing game format, and it was accomplished in approximately 18 months of development under conditions that most game developers would consider prohibitive. Each of the 8 companions in the base game of New Vegas has a full personal quest, a set of location-specific observations, a relationship arc with the player character, a combat style that reflects their personality and background, a set of perks that they provide based on how they feel about the player, and a post-game ending slide that describes what happened to them based on the choices made during their questline. Building one of these companions to this standard in any development environment would be a substantial commitment of writing and design time. Obsidian built 8 of them, plus additional companions across the 4 DLCs, in a compressed timeline that the whole project operated under. The writing team that accomplished this was led by Sawyer and Avalone, with significant contributions from John Gonzalez, Travis Stout, Eric Fenstermaker, and several others. The companions show the work. Veronica's questline about the Brotherhood of Steel and the limits of institutional loyalty, Raoul's questline about the costs of immortality and the question of when to stop fighting, EDE's questline, in which a robot's recorded memories gradually reveal a history that neither the player nor the robot was expecting to find. These are not filler quests. They are stories that the writers cared about, written for characters the writers found interesting, completed under deadline pressure that makes their quality more remarkable rather than less. The Easter eggs in the companion system are the specific details that reveal the research behind the characters. Raul's backstory places him in Mexico City in the years before the Great War, which gives the writers the opportunity to reflect the specific character of pre-war Mexican culture as filtered through the Fallout universe's retro-futuristic aesthetic. The locations he describes, the social dynamics he remembers, the specific quality of his nostalgia for a place and time that no longer exist. These details have specificity that comes from someone doing research rather than inventing generic background. Cass Rose of Sharon Cassidy carries a specific drinking problem, specific skills from a caravan trading background, specific relationship to the NCR that comes from her father's history with that organization. These are not arbitrary character traits. They are the result of someone thinking about what a second-generation descendant of Fallout 2's Cassidy would look like 60 years later, in the context of a grown NCR and a wasteland that has changed significantly since the events of the earlier games. Arcade Gannon's entire character, his enclave heritage that he cannot escape, his commitment to the followers of the apocalypse as a way of building a different identity, his specific intelligence and his specific sarcasm, and his specific relationship to authority represents a writer working through questions about inheritance and choice, and the relationship between where you come from and who you become. These are real questions. They produce a character who feels real in ways that matter during the 80 or 100 hours players spend with him. The Courier's Mile and the Geography of Consequence. The Courier's Mile is a location in the Lonesome Road DLC for Fallout New Vegas that most players who have completed the DLC entered once, accomplished what they needed to accomplish there, and left. It is not a comfortable place to spend time. It is described in the DLC's lore as the most heavily irradiated area in the Mojave, the place where the nukes that the Courier unknowingly delivered to the Divide actually landed, the ground zero of the catastrophe that the DLC is structured around. It is hostile in ways that go beyond the normal hostility of the wasteland. It wants you to leave. The specific radiation levels in the Courier's Mile are a design choice that communicates something the DLC cannot say directly. When the player walks through the area, the radiation is high enough to drain health quickly without significant protection, and the enemies present are both dangerous and specific. The tunnelers that populate the Divide are faster and more aggressive in this area than elsewhere. The space is asking something of the player that normal spaces do not ask. Sustained discomfort, the pressure of being somewhere that is actively bad for you, the sense that you should not be there and that the world agrees. This is the landscape of consequence in its most literal form. The Courier came here once, before the game's story, without knowing what they were bringing. The landscape has been defined by what they brought. Walking through the Courier's Mile is walking through your own history rendered in terrain, and the history is not comfortable to inhabit. The Easter egg is that the discomfort is the point. The design of the Courier's Mile is not bad difficulty design. It is accurate emotional design. The place where you caused destruction by accident should be uncomfortable to revisit. The place where your choices, even unconscious, uninformed choices, produced consequences, should not be easy to inhabit. The game is doing something with the radiation damage and the aggressive enemies that a cutscene or a dialogue box could not do. It is making the history physical, making the consequence something the player experiences in their body through the mechanics, rather than only understanding intellectually through the story. What the terminal entries know that you do not. Every Fallout game is full of terminals, the pre-war computers that have continued running for 200 years, their batteries sustained by the same ambiguous fusion technology that keeps everything in the Fallout universe functional well past its expected operational life. Every terminal contains records. Not all records are accessible. Some require specific unlock codes, some require hacking skill checks, some require a companion who can provide access. But the records that are accessible, for the player who reads them all, constitute a library that most players have never fully explored. The terminal entries in Fallout 3's vaults tell stories that the game does not tell through quest dialogue. The Overseer's log in Vault 101, the vault where the game begins, contains a complete history of the vault's administration from its founding through the present, and that history is darker than anything the main quest communicates directly. The decisions the Overseer made about who could leave the vault, about how to maintain population stability, about what information to suppress to prevent panic. These are documented in entries that span 200 years and that reveal an institution that lost its moral compass somewhere in the long silence of the apocalypse. The terminal entries in Vault 87, in Fallout 3, the vault where the FEV was being studied and where the first generation of Fallout 3's super mutants were created, contain research notes that document the progression of the experiment with scientific detachment that gradually breaks down as the researchers begin to understand what they are creating. The early entries are professional. The later entries are frightened. The final entries are made by people who have realized that there is no longer a difference between them and what they have been studying. The research notes in Vault 22 in New Vegas are among the most carefully constructed of any in the series. They begin as genuine agricultural science studies of fungal cultivation, records of growth rates and yield calculations, optimistic projections about what the research could mean for post-war food supply. They progress through increasing concern about anomalous behavior in the experimental specimens. They arrive at protocols for containing something that is not containing. They end with a final entry made by someone who understood exactly what was about to happen and who wrote it down anyway, for no one in particular, because the record mattered even when there would be no one left to read it. That final entry, in whatever form it takes and whatever vault you are reading it from, is always the same kind of document, a person choosing to be legible at the moment when legibility stops serving any function. Writing because the act of writing is an assertion of personhood even in the face of its cessation. The Fallout games fill the world with these final entries, and they treat each one with enough care to make it feel like a real document from a real person rather than set dressing. That care is the Easter egg. The care is the whole point. The ghouls and what they remember Fallout's living archives. In the Fallout universe, a ghoul is what happens when a human being is exposed to sufficient radiation without dying from it. The radiation changes them, their skin deteriorates, their life expectancy expands towards something approaching indefinite, their physical capabilities are altered in ways that vary between individuals. Most ghouls are feral. The radiation has damaged their neurological function to the point where the person who was there is no longer accessible. But some ghouls retain their full cognitive function, and these individuals exist as living archives of the world before the bombs. A ghoul who was 20 years old when the bombs fell in 2077 would be 220 years old at the time of Fallout 4. They would have memory, direct, personal, experiential memory of the pre-war world. They would remember what the technology was like, what the political situation was, what the cultural life of the pre-war period felt like from the inside. They would also have 200 years of post-war experience, 2 centuries of watching the world they knew become the world the player is walking through. The Fallout games have used ghoul characters as vehicles for exactly this kind of direct testimony when it served the story. Raul Tejada's age and his memories of Mexico City are the most explicit example in New Vegas. Confessor Cromwell in Fallout 3 has been preaching at the nuclear bomb in Megaton since the bomb was new. Roy Phillips, the ghoul who is trying to get into Tenpenny Tower, has a history with the tower and with Tenpenny that predates the game's present by decades. But the most systematically developed ghoul character in the series may be Roy Batty. No, not that Roy Batty the ghoul who exists not as a named character but as a type that recurs across all the games. The ghoul who remembers. The person who was there and survived. In Fallout 4, the Far Harbor DLC's Dima is a synth rather than a ghoul, but he occupies the same narrative role, an entity old enough to have been present at key moments in the post-war history of his region, who carries memories that the player cannot access any other way, who is both resource and unreliable narrator because memory is always unreliable narrator. What these characters know is the Easter egg. When Raul talks about 1940s Mexico City with specific enough detail that it feels like testimony rather than background, the game is giving you access to a historical perspective that the player character cannot otherwise have. The world before the bombs is gone. The only way to experience it is through documentation, pre-war holotapes, terminal entries, photographs, or through the memory of someone who was there. The ghouls are the Fallout universe's version of oral history, carrying the pre-war world inside them into a present that can barely imagine it. The tragedy embedded in this, the Easter egg that exists for the player who thinks about it, is that the ghouls who could testify are also the ones that most of the post-war world treats as monsters. The feral ghouls are the dominant type that most wastelanders encounter, and the logical response to an encounter with a feral ghoul is violence. Sentient ghouls exist in a world where the default assumption about ghouls is hostility, and navigating that assumption is a constant condition of their existence. The living archives of the pre-war world are systematically excluded from the post-war society that needs what they know. This is not a subtle argument, but it is an argument that the series makes consistently, and it is made through design as much as through dialogue. In Fallout 3 and 4, you can frequently kill ghouls by treating them as you would treat feral ghouls, and the game will let you do this, and the only correction comes from what you know about the individual you have chosen to treat as a category rather than as a person. The music of Travis and the question of courage. Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4 is easy to take for granted. It plays in the background, it covers the silence of the Commonwealth. Travis Miles does his job with the low-grade panic of someone who does not quite believe they deserve the job they have, and eventually if you complete his questline he does not. The radio changes. His voice changes. The companion quest called Confidence Man is, in terms of gameplay time and obvious reward, one of the less dramatic stories the game tells. But Confidence Man is doing something that most of the game's content is not doing. It is a story about a person overcoming something internal rather than external. Travis is not fighting super mutants or solving a mystery or recovering a lost artifact. He is learning to be less afraid. He is learning to inhabit his own capabilities without apologizing for them. This is, in a game about a post-apocalyptic wasteland full of external dangers, an unusual kind of quest to include, and the people who designed it clearly understood that it was unusual and built it anyway. The specific change in Travis's voice and on-air personality after completing the quest is something that requires sustained listening to the radio to notice. It is not announced by any notification. There is no dialogue indicating that the change has occurred. You simply have to keep listening to Diamond City Radio after completing Confidence Man, and if you are paying attention, you hear someone different doing the same job with more ease. The songs he plays around this shift, the stories he tells between them change in texture. He is more present. He sounds like someone who has decided to stop apologizing for taking up space. The game trusts you to notice this or not notice this, as you choose. It does not require you to notice it to receive credit for completing the quest. It simply makes the change real in the world, and lets the world reflect it in the way the world reflects most things in the Fallout games. Quietly, in the background, accessible only to the player who is paying attention to the right frequency. The moment before the war, pre-war sequences, and what they teach you. Fallout 3 begins before the apocalypse. The opening sequence played in a domestic suburban house, in a neighborhood that looks like the idealized 1950s American suburban neighborhood, with warm light and cheerful furniture and a family that seems happy in the specific way that the era's domestic ideology said families were supposed to be happy, establishes the pre-war world through the player's most personal possible access point, childhood. You are born in this sequence. You grow up through tutorial moments that are structured as the milestones of a child's life. Learning to walk, learning to read, celebrating a birthday. This is not standard game design. The tutorial sequence in Fallout 3 is a piece of narrative architecture that serves several functions simultaneously. It teaches you the game's mechanics through the metaphor of learning to be a person. It establishes the emotional stakes of the game's world by giving you a personal investment in the pre-war period before it becomes ruins. And it sets up the loss that structures the main story, the father who leaves, who must be found through the experience of a relationship rather than through an expository summary. The Easter eggs embedded in this sequence are the details that become legible only once the player has been through the full game and returns to the opening with more knowledge. The newspapers on the counter describe events in the Fallout universe's pre-war timeline. The television programs visible on screens in the background reference institutions and products and cultural productions that appear in the wider game world. The conversations the father has with other Vault residents establish character relationships that the game's main story later elaborates. None of this requires the player to process it on the first run. The tutorial is designed to work as a tutorial regardless of how much attention you pay to the background. But the people who designed those background details put them there because the world they were building had a history, and they wanted that history to be present in the opening sequence even if most players did not consciously register it. The pre-war world is the ghost that the post-war world is haunted by, and the game introduces you to the ghost in the opening minutes, before you know it is a ghost. Fallout 4's pre-war sequence accomplishes something similar and more ambitious. The game begins on the day of the nuclear exchange, not in the comfortable pre-war period, but in the specific hours of October 23, 2077, when the warning sirens are going off and the family is trying to reach the vault before the bombs fall. The opening sequence of Fallout 4 is the most direct depiction of the Great War in any mainline game. You see the flash, you see the destruction. You are in cryosleep watching through a frosted glass panel as the world outside continues to change. The specific details visible through the vault's window during the cryosleep sequence, the changing conditions outside, the evidence of what happened to the vault's population over the 200 years of the sleep are accessible only at the very beginning of the game, before the player understands what they are seeing. Most players focus on the story being told to them, rather than on the peripheral information available in the environment. The players who stop and look carefully, who rotate the camera to examine what is visible in every direction, find a sequence of events compressed into a few moments of animated background that tells a story the game never narrates directly. The courier carries everything on inventory and the metaphysics of carrying. One of the small, consistent Easter eggs of the Fallout franchise is the inventory system and what it implies about the protagonist's relationship to the world they are walking through. The player character in Fallout games can carry an enormous amount of stuff. Weapons, ammunition, armor, food, medication, crafting components, decorative items, random pieces of junk that might theoretically be useful. The amount of mass they are carrying at any given moment would be physically impossible for any actual human being to transport, even accounting for the Fallout universe's various physical augmentations. The games acknowledge this through the carry weight system, a limit on how much the player can carry, with penalties for exceeding it. But the limit is high enough that most players never experience it as a genuine constraint on their accumulation. The Fallout player character is, within the fiction, a person who wanders the wasteland carrying everything they might ever need and everything they might ever find useful, at all times, just in case. This is not a design failure. It is a decision about who the player character is, made by designers who understood that the fantasy of the open world is partly a fantasy of preparedness, of having the right thing when the right thing is needed, of never being caught without the tool the moment requires. The inventory system supports this fantasy by giving the player a capacious ability to accumulate, and the game world supports it by filling the world with things worth accumulating. The Easter egg embedded in this is that the courier, specifically, is characterized in the New Vegas lore as someone whose whole identity is carrying things. Their job courier is to carry things. Their origin story in Lonesome Road is about carrying something without knowing what it was. Ulysses' anger at the courier is about what the courier's willingness to carry without asking has enabled. The inventory system and the character's professional identity and the narrative of Lonesome Road are all saying the same thing. This is a person defined by what they carry. What they are carrying right now is who they are. And the specific, complicated thing about being a person defined by carrying is that you are always responsible for what you agreed to take, whether or not you understood what it was when you agreed. Nuka World and the economics of brand loyalty. The satire that runs deeper than you think. The Nuka-Cola brand is the most comprehensively developed piece of corporate satire in the Fallout franchise, and it has been expanded with each successive game until it constitutes one of the most elaborate fictional corporate histories in the medium. By the time Fallout 4 and its Nuka World DLC have said everything they have to say about it, Nuka-Cola is a portrait of a specific kind of corporate ambition, the ambition to become not just a product but a way of life, not just a drink, but a value system that is recognizable in the real world in ways that the franchise never explicitly names. The original Nuka-Cola was a soft drink. In the Fallout universe's pre-war timeline, it became the dominant soft drink in North America through the same combination of marketing, distribution, manufacturing scale, and product variation that characterized real soft drink companies' market dominance in the mid-20th century. Nuka-Cola had flavors. It had collectibles. It had a mascot, the Nuka-Cola Girl, a pin-up figure deployed in advertising campaigns that reflected the era's gender dynamics. It had a theme park, Nuka World, built on a scale that suggests the company's belief that its brand could anchor an experiential destination, the way real theme parks anchor real brands. The theme park is where the satire becomes its most explicit. Nuka World, in Fallout 4's DLC, is a ruined version of a pre-war amusement park built around the Nuka-Cola brand, a place where every attraction, every zone, every piece of architecture was designed to deepen the consumer's relationship to a soft drink. Nuka World is not a park with a soft drink sponsor. It is a park where the soft drink is the content, where the experience being offered is immersion in the brand as total environment. This is a real phenomenon in the real world, the experiential marketing strategy that transforms a product into a lifestyle, that makes consumption of the product feel like participation in something larger than a transaction, and Nuka World's ruins make the endpoint of that strategy visible. The collectible Nuka-Cola caps, which function as currency in the post-war economy, represent the final twist in the satire. The thing that Nuka-Cola put on its bottles as a promotional device, the thing that was supposed to function as a token of brand engagement in the pre-war consumer economy, has become the post-war world's medium of exchange. The brand outlasted the civilization that produced it, and its packaging became money. The marketing strategy succeeded so completely that the product's containers survived the death of the product and the death of the civilization that needed the product and became the foundation of a new economic system. Vault-Tec built the vaults, but Nuka-Cola built the economy. Both of them did it without intending to. The Easter eggs within Nuka World, the references to specific real-world theme parks, and corporate marketing strategies and flavor innovations are built on research into actual corporate history. The developers of Fallout 4 who designed the Nuka-Cola brand's extended universe were clearly familiar with the history of the Cola Wars, with the specific dynamics of experiential marketing in the late 20th century, and with the way that brand identity had come to function as a substitute for other kinds of identity in consumer societies. The satire works because it is accurate. Nuka-Cola is funny because the things it is exaggerating are real. What happens to the Institute science and its consequences? The Institute in Fallout 4 is the most technologically advanced faction in any Fallout game, an underground research facility that has been conducting cutting-edge science for 200 years in the ruins of what used to be MIT, developing technology that makes everything else in the wasteland look primitive. They can create synthetic humans indistinguishable from real ones. They can teleport. They have replaced their leadership class with an administrative structure of scientific division directors who are accountable primarily to the results of their research rather than to any ethical framework external to that research. The Institute is a portrait of a specific institutional failure that is recognizable in real scientific history. The research institution that has become so internally focused, so committed to the internal values of scientific progress as an end in itself, that it has lost track of the relationship between its work and the world outside its walls. The Institute researchers are not evil in the way that cartoon villains are evil. They are not cruel for cruelty's sake. They are committed to their science, and their commitment to their science has produced things that are harmful to the people outside their facility, and they have developed various rationalizations for why this is acceptable or why the people outside are not their concern. The specific research programs that the Institute runs, the FEV research, the synthetic human program, the agricultural research that never seems to find its way outside the Institute's walls, reflect real questions in research ethics about the relationship between scientific investigation and social responsibility. The Institute's argument, when pressed, is that the wasteland is too chaotic and too dangerous for the Institute's work to benefit it directly, that the people in the wasteland are too primitive to use advanced technology wisely, that the Institute needs to continue developing its capabilities before it can meaningfully engage with the outside world. These arguments are versions of arguments that real research institutions have made in real contexts about why their work has not yet produced the benefits it is supposed to produce. The Easter egg embedded in the Institute's design is the degree to which it is a portrait of a place that stopped asking the most important question. What is this for? The Institute knows how to make synthetic humans. It does not have a clear answer to why it is making synthetic humans, beyond the internal research logic that having solved one problem suggests solving the next one. The synths it has produced are persons. The game makes this clear enough that the player has to decide what to do with it, and the Institute's refusal to acknowledge this is the most complete expression of its institutional failure. The synthetic human program is the research that got away from the researchers, and the Institute is the institution that cannot see it. The Deathclaw and the terror of the beautiful design. Deathclaws are the Fallout franchise's most iconic monster, and their design, the specific combination of elements that makes them visually effective as terrifying creatures, is the product of careful thought about what makes something scary at a visual level. They are large but not gigantic. They are fast. They have a profile that is both animal and wrong. The body type of a predator, scaled up and modified in ways that suggest intelligence behind the eyes. Their claws are disproportionate to their body in the way that real predators' most dangerous features are often disproportionate. They are designed to read as danger from any distance. The lore origin of the Deathclaw, established across multiple games and supplementary documents, traces them to a pre-war military program that used a species of chameleon as the baseline for a genetically engineered combat animal. The specific animal they were developed from, the specific modifications that were made, the specific ways the genetic engineering diverged from its intended design, as the creatures bred in the wild. All of this is documented in fragments across various games. The Deathclaw you encounter in the wasteland is several generations removed from the original military experiment, shaped by 200 years of natural selection in a radioactive environment, as much as by the original engineering. What the lore is doing here is taking the concept of military animals, real programs that various governments and militaries have pursued over the years, training animals for combat roles or using animals as biological weapons in various forms, and extrapolating it through the Fallout universe's specific version of genetic science to produce something that makes sense within the fiction while being clearly impossible in reality. The Easter egg is the research, the knowledge that the developers understood the actual history of military animal programs, that they grounded their creature design in something recognizable before extending it into the impossible. The Deathclaw has been redesigned multiple times across the series, with each installment adjusting the specific visual presentation while maintaining the core characteristics that make the creature effective. Fallout 4's version is significantly more detailed than earlier versions, with surface texture and muscle articulation and behavioral animation that make encounters with them feel more visceral than in earlier games. The design work has accumulated across decades, each iteration building on what worked about the previous one and refining what did not. The most unexpected Deathclaw design choice in the series occurs in the first Fallout game, where Deathclaws can drop claws as loot physical claws that were presumably on the creature and are now available for the player to carry. The Deathclaw is so comprehensively terrible that even after it is dead, the things that made it terrible are available for collection. This is consistent with the Fallout franchise's broader approach to the wasteland as a place where everything that was once dangerous or significant can be converted into resource, which is itself a comment on what the wasteland has made of humanity's survivors. The Grognak comics and the culture that survived. Among all of the pre-war cultural artifacts scattered across the Fallout games, few have been developed as completely as the Grognak the Barbarian comics that appear as collectibles throughout multiple games. Grognak is a pre-war comic book hero, a barbarian warrior in the tradition of Robert E. Howard's Conan, rendered in the visual style of Golden Age American comics, and the comics themselves are genuine artifacts of a fictional culture's popular entertainment. The specific issues of Grognak that appear across the games have titles and cover art and implied storylines that are consistent with each other, suggesting that whoever designed the Grognak comics for each game was working from some kind of shared reference, some internal document establishing what the Grognak comics universe was like. The covers reference specific storylines and characters. The issues appear in a logical order. Grognak exists as a complete fictional franchise, rather than a loosely associated collection of similar-looking props. In Fallout 4, the Silver Shroud quest allows the player character to adopt the identity of a different pre-war fictional hero, a pulp detective who appears in a radio drama rather than a comic book, and the Silver Shroud's fiction is as internally consistent as Grognak's. Both franchises reflect the specific pre-war culture's specific popular entertainment tastes. Adventure stories, genre fiction, hero narratives, both survived the apocalypse as physical objects because they were stored in places that were preserved in warehouses, in collectors' basements, in gift shops that sealed when the bombs fell. The Easter egg is the investment. Nobody who plays Fallout 4 needs the Grognak comics to tell them anything about the game's world that they could not understand without the comics. The comics exist as collectible items that provide a small mechanical bonus when found, but the designers of those items gave them fictional depth that the items do not need to function as collectibles. They did the work because the world deserved it, because a pre-war culture would have had fictional franchises that people cared about, and because the ruined warehouses full of unsold Grognak comics speak to something true about the civilization that produced them and then destroyed itself. Conclusion: the world that never stopped being built. The Fallout franchise has been producing games for nearly 3 decades, and the secret layer that runs beneath all of those games, the Easter eggs, the developer signatures, the lore connections, the environmental stories, the hidden rooms and the cut content, and the conditional dialogue that almost nobody triggers, is not a collection of separate surprises. It is evidence of a sustained commitment to the idea that games can be made with the same density of intention that the best novels and films are made with. Every Easter egg in Fallout that we have talked about in this video is evidence of someone doing more than was required, more than the design document asked for, more than the schedule had room for, more than the player was ever likely to find. They did it because they were building a world, and worlds are full of things that most observers will never encounter, and the fullness of the things that nobody encounters is what makes the world feel real to the people who do. The most famous game design maxim says that if you build something and nobody sees it, the time was wasted. The Fallout games have spent 30 years proving that this is not always true. The terminal entries nobody reads, the dialogue conditions nobody triggers, the developer signatures nobody finds unless they remove the transparency from a texture file. The connections between games that require knowing the whole series to recognize. All of this work, poured into a world that most players will never fully explore. The world is richer for all of it, even the parts nobody ever finds.